that are now losing this? Like, yes, they don't have to pay $250 million a year, but...
No, so the cable TV business, because of cord cutting,
yeah,
is in a very bad spot. And that is why the big media stocks have been generally underperforming significantly over the last several years, because investors are asking the same question you're asking. It's like, hey, they used to make a lot of money when every household in America paid a cable bill or a satellite TV bill every month. Now only about half of the households do it. It's amazing, just in the last 7 or 8 years. So that revenue that was going to the cable network owners, it's just not there to the same degree.
But will those people, though, pay? Okay, so you have like Amazon Prime, you have Netflix, you have Peacock. Like, they all have different sports and they're paying different stuff. Are people like me going to pay an extra $1 or $2 or something for all of them?
That remains to be seen. That remains to be seen. You are, if you look at your Visa bill, seeing lots of other charges for your Netflix and your Peacock and your this and your that.
That's interesting.
You add it all up, boy, it looks just like your cable bill looked 4 or 5 years ago. Same dollar amount, same thing, and it's just. But anyway, but the economics have been changed, and so anywho, if you're Netflix, the big thing for Netflix is they said for the longest time, we don't have any interest in sports. We don't have interest in live events. Not that I'm calling wrestling a sport, Mr. Tucker. I'm just saying live events, sports and sports-like content.
Don't call it fake because you'll get beat up.
I know I will. But so this is really the big first foray into live program. That's why it's important for Netflix.
But interesting is that they have done a lot of docs when it comes to sports, right? Like the David Beckham thing. Or something else, and I'm forgetting because it's sports related. But like those have done really well. So I wonder if there's going to be like a doc on WWE or something along those lines, and like that's how they're going to broaden it out to a different audience.
Well, a lot of people have said, "Why don't you bid for football or stuff like that?" And I don't think they want to get involved in that craziness, the costs associated with sports. That's always been their response: is it's just too expensive.
But WWE is a good story.
Yeah, the WWE is a good story, and you can build a lot around that in terms of programming. And the people at Netflix, they know how to do that, so they're very good at the programming thing. So, so it's pretty cool. It's a big deal. TKO Group Holdings, that's the stock. TKO is the ticker, and it's up a good 18.5% on the news that Netflix is going to be broadcasting their stuff. Right now, WWE President Nick Khan, he speaks with Bloomberg's Katie Greifeld and Ed Ludlow on the Netflix Raw deal, which has been such a big deal for both Netflix and for TKO Holdings. Let's take a listen right now.
We welcome now our TV audience and our radio listeners for more on Netflix's deal to acquire exclusive rights to Raw and other programming from WWE. I'm pleased to say we're joined now by WWE President Nick Khan, and still with us is Bloomberg Technology co-host Ed Ludlow. Ed, take it away.
Yeah, Nick, welcome to the program, and thank you for your time. This is interesting. I don't think anyone saw this coming, really. Let's start with like this cultural and audience question, right? Because the deal focuses on Raw. The value of the deal, we're reporting $5 billion over 10 years. But there might be an audience out there that's like the most loyal SmackDown fan that says, hey, I'd love to be watching WWE SmackDown on streaming platforms as well.
Sure, understood. Look, we're pleased with the deal, and we love the fact that Netflix was willing to take a bet on us. As we know, they had said previously that they were not into sports rights. The good thing about WWE, it's sports entertainment, as you said before the quick break there. So we're an entertainment property as much as we are a sports property. 52 weeks a year live, consistent programming, an audience that is actually quite global. If you look at India, and India is not part of this deal, but if you look at India, we're the second most popular sport in India. If you look at the United Kingdom, we're the 4th most popular sport there. This deal will take effect in the UK. So in addition to the United States, it allows us to gain even a greater global footprint as we look to expand the business.
Well, Nick, I want to talk a little bit more about the decision to go with Netflix, go with a streamer versus staying with a Comcast, for example. Did this purely come down to numbers where you were going to get the better deal, or is this, in effect, a bet on where the future eyeballs are going to be?
Well, look, we continue to love NBCU. We have SmackDown on USA premiering this October there. We have our premium live events, formerly our pay-per-views, like WrestleMania on Peacock exclusively in the United States. They've been tremendous. For us with Raw, it was yet another test of someone new in the space, obviously an established streaming entity, the streaming entity, if you will. It was a good bet by us, and we think a good bet by them.
Nick, there's kind of two sides to it, right, from 2025. the regularity of a by appointment tuning into Raw, and then there are the pay-per-view events and specials throughout the year. Historically, if you think about Showtime, the distributor got 30% from a revenue split perspective. My understanding is that if you're a Netflix user, there's no additional cost for WrestleMania or those set-piece events. Are you able to clarify that if you're not a Netflix subscriber, you do just pay a normal pay-per-view charge? And how will you and Netflix split those revenues globally? Because a lot of this is ex-US, right? It's an international deal.
Correct. You're 100% correct. There is no upcharge for WrestleMania or the other premium live events anywhere in the globe where it's on Netflix. No upcharge. The 30% you talk about, the traditional pay-per-view model, WWE was the first mover to get out of that space in 2014 when we started WWE Network, which brought WWE direct to consumer on our own OTT platform. From there, 2 or 3 years ago, we licensed that content to Peacock. That was when the streaming wars began. What we realized was a company of our size, as great as we'd like to believe we are, we're not going to compete technologically with the Amazons of the world, with the Netflixes of the world, with the NBCUs of the world. So it made sense to start it in 2014 to get rid of that excessive charge that in-demand, Dish, Direct were charging for pay-per-views, and to bring the cost down for our consumer. We think Netflix furthers that.
Let's talk about ad pricing a little bit more here. Does this give you greater ad pricing power, this deal?
We think so. Look, you've seen what Amazon's been able to do on their ad-supported tier. Netflix is going to have great success in that space. WWE, again, 3 hours a week on Raw, every week allows Netflix to monetize this deal in the advertising space in a way that has not been seen before.
Hey, Nick, Raw has this kind of super loyal and sizable audience, but there must be a part of this deal where you're like, okay, we need to think about the future and growing a new audience. And I wondered if there's any terms in the deal where Netflix goes away and produces a behind-the-scenes kind of documentary exclusive to Netflix that introduces WWE to that new audience. Think about, like, what am I thinking of? Drive to Survive and Formula One and the success that that had, bringing a sport to a new audience.
It would be a mistake by us at WWE to not do that with Netflix. So assume that what you said is exactly what we're all thinking, we being Netflix and WWE. You saw what Drive to Survive did for Formula One, as you just mentioned. We think the WWE audience, already big on a global level, only gets bigger with a show like that.
So potentially a lot to look forward to. So it sounds like WWE and Netflix are going to work on things outside of Raw here, that it's not just about this one program.
Keep in mind, at WWE, we have a whole treasure trove of intellectual property that is largely untouched. So if you look at what Disney has done, certainly that was through acquisition, with Marvel, with Lucasfilm. If you look what Warner Brothers Discovery did when they acquired DC a long time ago, you now have this treasure trove at Netflix that's available to produce. So things like The Undertaker, characters that have been created over time, we're looking forward to getting to all of that with Netflix as well.
Nick, a really fantastic question that our producer Joe Chaffee has is about tech and infrastructure. This deal doesn't kick in until Jan 2025. Is that because Netflix needs time to know they can support a live stream of that scale weekly?
No, not at all. It just timed out budget-wise to start in January. But I'll tell you this, WWE, with the WWE Network that I referenced from 2014, we're turnkey programming. So number one, Netflix knows how to distribute it and make sure that it goes around the world live. It's not going to be any issue. We also know how to do it. So the partnership, even on that level, we think it's going to be a great thing.
Nick, 10 seconds. How many new eyeballs will you get in 2025 that you don't have already through this deal?
Well, look, against the college football playoff, the two semifinals game on a Monday night a couple weeks ago, you're talking about Michigan, Alabama in the game. We did a 0.6 in the demo with millions in the overall rating, again, against stiff competition. So we think with the Netflix reach, it's millions and millions around the globe. We're excited about the whole thing.
All right, our big thanks to Nick Khan, WWE president, and of course, Bloomberg Technology co-host, Ed Ludlow.
All right, some good stuff there. WWE President Nick Khan speaking with Bloomberg's Katie Greifeld and Ed Ludlow on Netflix acquisition of exclusive rights to Raw and other programming from WWE. $5 billion over 10 years. A big, big deal. TKO Group Holdings, the company that owns WWE, that stock is up 18% today, so the street likes that news. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We will get world and national news with Lee Marsh.
All right, thank you, Paul. Israel has taken its first worst single-day loss since its all-out assault on Hamas began in Gaza after the October 7th attack. 24 soldiers have been killed in an attack in central Gaza. Bloomberg's news director for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, Rosalind Matheson, says the timing of this incident is critical.
It comes at a time when the support levels inside Israel for the conflict with Hamas in Gaza seem to be rising. There's a hardening of views inside Israel that despite international concern that Israel itself faces this existential threat from Hamas going forward and possibly also from Hezbollah.
Bloomberg's Roz Matheson says supporters are firmly behind the ultimate goal of wiping out Hamas. It is primary day in New Hampshire. Bloomberg's Laura Davison is there as part of our political team covering today's primary. She says the polls in New Hampshire can be somewhat inaccurate.
New Hampshire is different in how it votes from many places, and that you have a large number of what they call undeclared voters. These are, essentially independents and neither Republicans nor Democrats, so they can go in on primary day and request the ballot of either party.
Bloomberg's Laura Davison in New Hampshire. Tune into our New Hampshire primary special tonight at 8 p.m. Wall Street time. Hear and watch it all live on Bloomberg Radio and television. Democrats in New Hampshire are calling on officials to investigate some suspicious robocalls. The New Hampshire Attorney General's office says it's investigating reports of an apparent robocall that used artificial intelligence to mimic President Biden, advising people in the state not to vote in the primary. The White House says the call was not recorded by the president. Mr. Biden, Vice President Harris are set to hold a rally together in Virginia. They'll be discussing abortion access. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris. This is Bloomberg. Here's John Tucker now with a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, thanks, Amy. With the major stock averages, they're mixed right now. Corporate earnings reports, they are in focus today. By and large, we've seen 2024 estimates kind of hold up. United Airlines jumping on better than expected earnings, leading airline stocks higher. And then Verizon advancing today after the telecom giant's guidance impressed analysts. That's the best performer in the Dow Jones Industrial Average right now. Meantime, with the Fed meeting not far off, Priya Misra at JP Morgan Investment sees rate cuts on the horizon, but she's not sure that the timing of all this really matters.
If you're trading the 2-year or the 10-year or equities or any asset class, what matters is the end point. How much are they cutting for what is the reason that they're cutting? Are they trying to normalize? Are they actually trying to ease policy?
And then you have General Electric slipping after the firm's Aero outlook. That disappointed analysts. 3M slumping. The manufacturer forecasting profits and sales growth for this year that trailed analysts' expectations. 3M is down right now $11. That is down just over 10.5% at this point. S&P 500 unchanged now, 4850 on the index. The Dow 113 points lower. The Nasdaq 100 is up 6 points. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Alex and Paul.
All right, John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Alex Steele, Paul Sweeney, we're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're also streaming live on YouTube. John, that's the internet, so you can go over to youtube.com and search.
I know what that is.
Oh, okay, good.
It's not just reading books.
Interweb, that's right, exactly. So we're here. All right, I'm looking at the IN Go function. That's a Bloomberg Index browser, looking at the fixed income space. Negative returns here across fixed income here. Last year, thanks to the rally at the end of the year, fixed income folks actually had some positive total returns there. Good year, because 2022 is just ugly here. So it's been tough space in fixed income. Let's get the latest outlook here. We can do that with Natalie Trevithick, head of investment grade credit strategy at Payden and Regal. So Natalie, you guys rallied. I'm going to say you guys being the fixed income folks kind of rallied there in November, December, got some positive returns. How are you approaching 2024?
Yeah, that was a sharp rally, and maybe it went a little bit too far, bringing forward some of 2024 returns. But despite the modestly negative returns year to date, investor appetite for corporate bonds is insatiable. We've already had over 150 billion of supply this year, and most deals are over 5 times subscribed. So there's just so much investor money trying to get invested in corporate bonds at these higher yields, despite the small rise in interest rates since the beginning of the year.
So then what happens when the Fed actually actually cuts.
Yeah, if the Fed cuts, that's just even better news for corporate bonds, since we think, there may be some potential widening in spreads, but that'd be offset by the move lower in interest rates. And even though the market's still pricing in a number of cuts this year, 5 to 6, we think they may come a little bit later than anticipated, maybe in the second half, because the economy is still looking strong.
So, I mean, what's the market like? Are you just, like when the phone, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, or whatever, calls you guys to buy a new issue, do you just buy it? Are people just buying these things, or are they saying, "Oh no, this is the maturity I want. This is the sector I want," or are they just kind of clamoring to get anything?
They're clamoring to get most things. There's been a ton of bank issuance, and people were afraid to touch banks for a while last year. They rallied sharply, and people can't get enough of them. We've had some of the big banks price $5 billion deals, and there's $20 billion of demand for them. So people are going after that, but they also want duration. So we haven't seen a lot of 30-year issuance, and whenever there's a 30-year deal, people just want to lock in these higher yields for longer. Whereas issuers, they rather borrow in the front end and not have these long-term high interest costs.
So if I'm a banker, I'm telling my issuers, we can go super covenant light, covey light, as we used to say back in the day. What is that? Are you guys are the buyers just so aggressive that they will maybe give on some covenants and things like that?
Yeah, it's getting to be that way in the high yield market. We're seeing less covenants. Generally in investment grade corporate bonds, we don't have many to begin with. So we're used
right.
to playing that game, but they are pushing spreads, to the brink.
Well, I have to be honest, guys. I'm normally risk averse anyway, but this makes me nervous. You have covenants sort of going by the wayside, massive issuance, still massive demand. From what you're saying, it seems a little bit indiscriminate. What's the risk potential here then?
Yeah, the risk would really be if we had a downturn in the economy, then banks would underperform. They're very much a beta for the market. But we do expect some volatility. We think spreads have come a long way. They ended last year 30 basis points tighter, and they're tighter even this year, despite those negative yields. So we think there could be some near-term volatility, and you see those negative returns over the short term. But with the 5.25%, average coupon on a new investment-grade credit, we think over the longer term you're going to clip that nice coupon and maybe get a little bonus if the Fed cuts. So we're looking at mid to high single-digit returns in investment-grade corporate this year.
Wow.
So are there sectors that you guys prefer these days in the credit space?
Yeah, we've actually started to like the REIT sector now that interest rates are off the high. We think that has room to perform, and there's still a strong labor market. We like some of the residential REITs, maybe staying away from some of the office REITs. We continue to be selective in the energy sector. There's been some attractive deals coming in that market, particularly within high yield, which we find compelling. And then banks are being pretty selective. We're looking for some of the banks which are coming at a little bit of a concession, but those have been pretty aggressively now. So it's really deal specific there.
Natalie, I'm also wondering, when you mentioned that, like, if we see a downturn, that would provide some rough volatility for the sector. What kind of downturn? Like softness versus like a deep recession? Like what happens if we just kind of have middling growth, for example?
Yeah, we're expecting that soft landing and maybe some middling growth, and that's almost a Goldilocks scenario for corporate bonds, since there's no real reason for them to widen, and you still have investors looking for that extra 100 basis points by going into corporate bonds over just treasuries. So you kind of hang out there and you get that coupon clipping year. Obviously, if it's a harder recession and it's unexpected, you could see spreads, blow out materially wider. But what we've seen is investors tend to step in when we got that volatility last year after the banking crisis. When spreads got to 165, there's a strong buyer base came back in and pulled spreads back in as we recovered.
So when you talk to issuers here, are they raising money because they can, because they have to, because, boy, they could have raised money a lot cheaper a couple of years ago. And why are companies coming to the market here, given that rates relative to the last several years are in fact higher?
Yeah, so corporate bonds these companies tend to issue, once a year, some of them multiple times a year, like the banks almost come every quarter. So just refinancing their existing debt is a lot of it, general corporate purposes. Some of it's for share buybacks, but you kind of hit the nail on the head, is that they refinanced a lot of their debt a few years ago, particularly in 30-year bonds. So they have a lot of duration out there already that they have at very low coupon payments. So now they're looking more at the front end and just continuing their normal borrowing schedule. It's actually interesting that the average coupon has only gone up about 50 basis points from the lows it hit last year. So it's only about 4.25% now. So it's not like they're refunding their entire debt stock each year.
So any kind of like massive wall of maturity that we've been worried about over the last 2 years that will come due and rates aren't going to be from the Fed at 0, that's not a thing.
That's really not a thing in investment grade bonds because, as I mentioned, companies have termed out their debt, issuing 20, 30, 40-year bonds. So there's no looming wall there. And high yield companies have had great access to the market. Supply has been a little bit light there. And there's a lot of private debt financing in that market. So we really don't see a big maturity wall looming in the next few years.
Natalie, do you guys at Payden & Regal, do you stay domestic U.S. or will you look at international issuers?
We'll look at international issuers as well. We have a great emerging markets team here.
And so what's kind of the view for you guys for emerging markets and just paper outside the U.S.?
Yeah, we think there's definitely opportunities in emerging markets. I'm going to defer to their team to give you the countries, but we think it could be a solid growth year for EM.
All right, Natalie, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Natalie Trevithick, Head of Investment Grade Credit Strategies, Payden & Regal here. So, all right, Alex, just get me up to speed here on the Oscar stuff. I mean, now you saw Barbie.
Oh, okay.
So
how much time do I have on this?
Yes. And so is this going to get recognized by the Academy, as they say?
Okay. Here's my feminist flag that's going to wait for a second, okay? I'm a huge Barbie fan, okay? So just save your critique for that. But the fact that Margot Robbie and the director of Barbie were not nominated for the Oscar feels to me, A, the point of the movie, and also just plain old wrong.
You're saying Barbie is an Oscar caliber
Have
film?
you seen it?
I wouldn't see that if you couldn't pay me enough.
Well,
to
then
see
how
that.
can you possibly? I've seen Oppenheimer and I've seen Barbie. So I am the only one on this table qualified to talk.
So give me the tie in the apparent snub, if you will, of Margot Robbie and the director. Is it a woman?
Yep.
And they were not nominated yet. Ken, played by Ryan Gosling, was nominated.
Yeah. First off,
and that raises some flags. And put that in the context of the movie itself.
Okay, my friends, if you have not seen the Barbie movie, it is all about women power and sort of being eroded in the real world, and then Ken finds his power, and then he beefs up and kicks Barbie out of Barbie Land, and it becomes a whole thing. So to me, just the fact that only Ryan Gosling was nominated, which he should have been, he was awesome, he was fantastic, and he shouldn't have been nominated, feels very much like the point of the movie. Like, here are these two women. I mean, Margot Robbie bought the rights to this in 2018, like right when before the Me Too movement really took off. Like, she has owned this.
Margot Robbie?
Yes,
is that right?
She produced it.
Wow.
She's owned this thing, and then to get that snub, I don't know. It feels hurtful. It feels hurtful.
I'm sure there's a Barbie blog running somewhere. This has got to be just flying all over the social media.
Oh, I don't know. I'm just on my soapbox, man. I don't know anyone else, but it's my soapbox, and that's what I'm sticking to.
This is a film that's, say, on the same caliber as Paul Scofield in A Man for All Seasons.
They're different movies, but they're different movies.
One film from
the
past.
You also can't compare, say, Oppenheimer and Barbie. They're very different movies with different messages. Doesn't mean that one is better than worse.
When a film wins an Oscar, it's of a certain caliber. It's like, top tier
that brings back the question.
Is it, though? Please.
Well,
is
for
it
Best Picture?
Is
what
it?
Are you saying?
Come on. Like, do we really think, I'm also a Lord of the Rings fan and total nerd, but do we really think Return of the King was like a super amazing quality caliber movie?
No, I just think our standards have declined.
Well, that's another issue.
John and I are
one of the issues coming out of that one of the issues in Hollywood has been, don't the people decide what's a great movie? And so if the box office for Star Wars is $1 gajillion, shouldn't that be considered?
Yeah, it's called people's choice.
Right. That's not how the Academy works.
No.
Obviously, it's like 3 people in a room, the farm, whatever it is, and they decide what's
And it's all
quality.
Politics, right?
Yeah, it's all politics.
It's all about press and sort of doing your thing and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, all with the backdrop of, are people going to go to movies anymore? Are people going to pay for them anymore? Is it going to still be as good a business as it was before? That's kind of the backdrop here for the industry.
Well, let's get John Tucker's take. When was the last time you went to a movie, and what was it? What caliber of film will draw you in?
I actually don't remember. I do have a collection at home, And yeah, I could give you my top 10.
VHS?
I was going to say VHS tapes.
No, they're Blu-ray discs or whatever. So I'm kind of advanced.
But it's, I tell you, it's still big business for Hollywood here, and it's still, I mean, people are asking me, the studios still care big time because it's just kind of bragging rights for the studio. And
the last one I saw was The Joker, which actually was a character study, which was actually wonderfully
well-done
acted.
Movie.
So.
And Heath Ledger absolutely should have won for that. Yes.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
Okay.
But Barbie.
And also Barbie should also be nominated in more categories.
Okay. That's where we differ.
Exactly.
But you need to see it. You cannot complain unless you haven't seen it.
You can't opine. That's right.
You see? Okay.
S&P 500 unchanged on the day. Let's get back to the business at hand. Nothing happening. And for Lisa Bromwich, I'm going to call that unched out there. The Dow Jones off about 0.4%. NASDAQ up about 0.1%. Yields a little bit higher here. 10-year Treasury, 4.14% on your 10-year. Looking at the commodities, oil pretty much unchanged here. It's had a little bit of strength here over the last 4, 5, 6 days. Brent crude had reached 80 earlier in the day. We're at 79.81, pretty much unchanged here. Gold a little bit higher, about 0.2%. Bitcoin, I don't call this. I got to talk to Mike McGlone of Bloomberg Intelligence. I don't know what's going on. It's off another 1.5%, 39,200. I thought it was supposed to go up with all these spot Bitcoin ETFs. What do I know? This is Bloomberg.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
And I'm John Tucker, the newsroom, with a look at some of the companies we're following today. 3M, the worst performing stock in the Dow Jones Industrial Average right now. The maker of Post-it notes, among other things, posting earnings. Forecast 2024 profit sales growth falling short of estimates. Now, 3M began slashing thousands of jobs, you'll recall, as part of the restructuring push, the biggest restructuring push in their history that helped lift profit margins and cash generation. That happened in the second half of last year. Yet, they say, broader economic environment that still remains muted, as they put it. And New Brunswick, New Jersey-based Johnson & Johnson opening its books this morning. Fourth quarter earnings beating analyst estimates. Sales in the drug and medical device units both exceeding analyst expectations. But the shares, they took a dive after the CFO said pharma sales are going to be lower in the second half of the year on declining sales of their psoriasis drug, Stelara. And Verizon stock, that's getting a pop today. They added the most mobile phone customers in 2 years. This is a turnaround story. Verizon's consumer group adding 318,000 mobile subscribers. And yes, more evidence today of the decline of Western civilization. Netflix acquiring the exclusive rights to Raw, as well as other programming from World Wrestling Entertainment, marking the streaming service's first big move into live events. And finally, research from Gallup, putting a price on workplace unhappiness. No unhappy people here, though. They say disgruntled employees cost U.S. companies an estimated $1.9 trillion in lost productivity last year. 1/3 of respondents in this survey said they are engaged at their jobs. Only 1/3 are engaged. And that is your company news.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, quick check of these markets. S&P unchanged, Dow off about 0.4%, NASDAQ unchanged. So from the index level, not a lot going on here. I am going to call out Bitcoin off 1.7%, 39,000 for Bitcoin, so below that $40,000 level, which had been key. 10-year treasuries, 4.14%. So that's a quick little snapshot of what's happening out there in the markets. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get World and National News with Amy Mars.
All right, thank you, Paul. Sweden is edging closer to joining NATO. Turkey planning to vote to approve Sweden's membership later today. We're watching that. Chaos in the Red Sea starting to bite into companies' profits and your wallet. We get more from Bloomberg's Steve Potus.
The Red Sea crisis is roiling shipments of everything from cars to energy. Several firms are already warning of the impact. Electric vehicle maker Tesla plans a 2-week production halt at a German plant due to shipment delays, while Sweden's Volvo car has announced a 3-day stoppage at one of its factories. Retailers Tesco, Marks & Spencer, and Next have all flagged the risk of higher prices for consumers. All that's because at least 2,300 ships are taking lengthy detours to avoid Houthi militants' attacks in the Red Sea, a waterway that normally handles over 12% of global sea trade. Steve Potus, Bloomberg Radio.
One of Boeing's biggest customers has lost confidence in the plane maker's ability to overcome the quality lapses that climaxed this month with a mid-air emergency on an Alaska Airlines flight. United Airlines Chief Executive Officer Scott Kirby has also spoken with Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg over the grounding, which is now heading into its 3rd week. The Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, a leading Harvard Medical School-affiliated teaching center, seeking retractions of 6 studies and corrections on another 31 papers amid allegations that some of its senior researchers falsified data. Oppenheimer, the leading nominee from the Academy Awards, 13 nominations now. Barbie was the summer's biggest box office hit, but it was nominated for only 8 awards, including Best Picture. Killers of the Flower Moon got 10 nominations. Poor Things got 11. And get this, the Associated Press got a nod for the first time ever for 20 Days in Mariupol, which got a Best Documentary nomination. The Oscars will be held March 10th in L.A. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. Paul and Alex.
Amy Mars, thank you so much. We appreciate it. China. You know, you look at it, and it's almost, I kind of feel like, uninvestable, given the China risk of the government can come in, like they did with the tech sector, Alibaba, and so on and so forth, and really put the kibosh on your business plan. But they're trying to restart this economy.
Yeah, but is it going to work? So basically the news overnight was that China's considering a 2 trillion yuan, that's about $278 billion package to stabilize the stock market because it's just completely tanked in the last few weeks. They'd basically buy it through onshore purchases through Hong Kong. The whole point is to stabilize the yuan enough to bring in foreign investment. It's $278 billion worth foreign investment into a country that feels very, very risky with growth at a 5 handle, but in the reality could look a lot different. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. And it's interesting, the timing of this story for China, because at the micro level, Jack Ma and Joe Tsai, co-founders of Alibaba, just reported here today about Bloomberg News, they have bought $200 million of stock in Alibaba, and that stock is trading up 6% higher. So there's two individuals that were, and I know Joe Tsai personally very well, those are 200 individuals that were just the epitome of the success of the Chinese technology economy. Alibaba and Tencent and all those other companies that were just such huge companies, owned by institutional investors around the world. And then the government came in and basically just, put a set of restrictions on that industry, the technology industry writ large, that just destroyed so much shareholder value that I've spoken to a lot of institutional investors who are core shareholders of some of those Chinese tech companies. They're like, I'm done. There's not a scenario where I go back into China. And I think that's true for a lot of investors, and that's really a challenge.
No matter if the government buys up a lot of stocks.
No. Yeah. I mean,
right.
It's just, again, now in the prospectus for Alibaba, there's 70 pages of risk factors. Basically, you could boil down to China risk, and that's in fact what would happen.
Right, and then add in the consumer risk too, and that's a whole different story. Anyway, we have a lot more coming up. We're going to talk more about the Oscars, and maybe we can debate Barbie more. Who doesn't want to stick around for that? This is Bloomberg Intelligence.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney.
The real outperformance has been the U.S. corporate high yield.
Are the companies lean enough? Have they trimmed all the fat?
The semiconductor business is a really cyclical business.
Breaking market headlines and corporate news from across the globe.
Do investors like the M&A that we've seen?
These are two big-time blue-chip companies.
The window between the peak and cut changing super fast.
Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, coming up in this hour, we're not kidding. We're taking this Oscar stuff seriously. It's so big for us that we went out to get Bloomberg Opinions columnist Bobby Ghosh. He's got a column out. He's usually talking about world affairs, Middle East, stuff like that.
Sure.
Now, he's got a column out there showing that the Oscars are doomed. So we're getting some smart voices on this whole Oscar discussion. We're taking it pretty seriously. Plus, we're going to talk politics with Jody Schneider. She is political news director for Bloomberg TV and Radio. Talked about the latest on the New Hampshire primary today. Then there's big news, obviously, in the media space, Netflix and wrestling and all that kind of stuff. So we got to go to our go-to person there on all things media and entertainment. That's Bloomberg Intelligence, senior U.S. media analyst Geetha Ranganathan. She'll join us in this hour. So a lot happening. Let's kick it all off with Mr. John Tucker.
All right, the major stock averages, they are mixed right now to little change. S&P 500, you have 7-11 major industry groups in the index. Lower communication services, that's in the lead in the index. That's where you find Verizon. It reported it's finally adding wireless subscribers after several quarters of declines. Healthcare, the biggest drag in the S&P 500. That's where you find Johnson & Johnson. The CFO there said pharma sales will be lower in the second half of the year. They're seeing declining sales of their psoriasis drug. Meantime, Katie Kaminsky at Alpha Simplex Group sees the Fed cutting rates, but not as soon as many investors think.
It's actually not that easy to get inflation down that quickly. It's going to take more time. That doesn't mean we're not in the right path. It just means that this disinflation hope is not really sort of going to happen in a month.
Right now, the S&P 500 down just a point, 48.49 of the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average 140 points lower. That's down 0.4%. And the NASDAQ 100 up a whopping 3 points right now. Let's do yields for you. The 10-year, which is the benchmark, that's up 4 basis points, 4.14. And the 2-year yield, 1 basis point higher. That's at 4.41. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Alex and Paul.
All right, John Tucker, thank you so much. Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney, we're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio, also streaming live on YouTube, so you can head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Radio. As John was just reporting, not a lot happening at the index level. Let's dig a little deeper. Nora Melinda can help us with that. She covers equities for Bloomberg News. Nora, what are you looking at?
United Airlines is fluctuating between the first and second biggest gainer by percentage in the S&P 500 this morning. It's since paired some of its advances, but it earlier surged as much as 10% for its biggest day in almost 2 years. This is all as profit is poised to beat Wall Street expectations this year as the carrier works to overcome the cost from a fallout of the Boeing MAX planes from earlier this month. Other airlines are all climbing off of this news, and this comes just a day after its CEO, Scott Kirby, criticized Boeing, saying that he was disappointed with what he called the plane maker's sluggish response to the grounding of the MAX 9 aircraft.
What's interesting, too, is that Bloomberg Intelligence, led by George Ferguson, awesome team there, talking about basically United Airlines earnings reinforce the view that U.S. travel demand is slowing. So there is that.
Yep.
Like, yeah, I get it. They did solid. They delivered, especially with costs rising. But it is a cooling demand scenario echoed by Delta as well. The question is sort of how fast.
Did you have revenge travel?
Yeah, but like a year later.
Okay.
So like it was last year I did all the revenge travel, and now not a chance.
Not a chance. Okay.
Yeah.
And international travel?
Yeah. So last year was Florence, it was Paris.
See,
everywhere.
John Tucker and I were the only
all
ones
the fancy,
that didn't go
right?
anywhere.
But you're going. Yeah, you did. Didn't you go?
I just went to Aruba.
Right.
Yeah. But,
Me too.
Yeah. Did you?
Yes, back in September.
Very cool. Okay. So I'm just wondering. I think a lot of that, from what I hear from the airlines, that's kind of played out. Now you're back to a little bit more normalized, I guess, activity.
Right. And like is normalized price into the stock, et cetera,
Right.
like that recalibration too.
Right. What else you got?
So flipping over to laggards, we've got the second biggest laggard in the S&P 500. That is D.R. Horton. Just digging back into that for a moment. That's ticker DHI. The homebuilder reported its first earnings gain in 5 quarters, but the firm's increase was less than analysts had initially expected. The stock is slumping as much as 7.7% for its worst day since November 2020. That's pulling peers like Lennar and Toll Brothers and KB Home down with it. Barclays analyst Matthew Booley urges investors to look at this moment as an opportunity to buy on weakness.
It says here that 80% of D.R. Horton's mortgage consumers use the rate buy down incentive.
Right.
So basically, they have to increase incentives to get people to buy homes. I can't tell what that's about. Is it just affordability, or is it just the D.R. Horton actual homes?
Right. I mean, it's a bit of both. I mean, that's what a lot of investors who may be a bit more bearish are nervous about when we're thinking about these home builders. You essentially have to offer incentives and these rate buy downs to entice people to buy from you. So what does that kind of say about, how much of presence and demand that you have there?
Yeah, but it's just, the stocks are just ripping, man. I'm looking over the trailing 12 months. D.R. Horton up 50%, Havanian up 180%, Pulte up 100%. So, it's probably a good business for them. But I think the real issue for the housing market, if I'm a housing analyst, if I own these stocks, is as interest rates come down, presumably that's going to free up the resale market, reducing demand for the new homes. And then how does that work? That's kind of what I want to figure out. RTX. What is RTX?
Yes, it's up for its biggest gain since November of 2020. That is the biggest gainer in the S&P 500 right now, up as much as 8.7%. The firm topped estimates after a tough year for its engine unit. It forecasts a 2024 profit that topped expectations as it ramps up work on a costly recall of its top-selling jet engine. So this is very welcome news for the company as it's preparing to transition to a new CEO amid intense investor scrutiny as it works through that recall of roughly 3,000 jet engines.
Right, we forget about that because we're all like, wait, what?
Yep.
It's not Boeing and Spirit Aerospace?
Exactly.
There's more engine stuff?
And again, George Ferguson, Bloomberg Intelligence, he's got the research out there if you want to check it out. BI, go on the terminal for all things Bloomberg Intelligence research. George is one of the best aerospace analysts on the street, and we got him. So it's good stuff. Nora Melinda, thanks so much for joining us. Nora Melinda covers the equities. All right. When we have Bobby Goshen here, we talk geopolitics, Middle East, what's going on there. Now he's got a column out on awards shows. So I go to read it, and then I go see, it's Bobby Goshen is Bloomberg opinion columnist covering culture. Previously, he covered foreign affairs. That's a pivot. Who makes that pivot from foreign affairs to like culture.
To Barbie.
It's a Barbie.
I don't know. How do you feel about that, Bobby?
About Barbie, not very much. Everyone's going to be talking about Barbie being snubbed for a couple of categories. I'm going to be the oddball who says, I'm glad to hear it. I hated the movie. I absolutely hated the movie, and I'm glad.
Sarah, I'm just going to step back and let these two go at it.
Okay, well, first of all, I guess it's not made for you. But do you know women of my age group that didn't like it or did like it?
My wife loves it. I know plenty of people, women and men, who loved it. I just didn't like it. I thought it was too loud and too tacky and too exploitative. And basically, it was a marketing campaign for a doll.
Oh, yeah. No,
I didn't
so
get it. I'm too cynical. You see, when you cover foreign affairs long enough, you become deeply, deeply cynical. And,
but I don't disagree that, in essence, it's still an ad for Mattel Barbie, 100%. But to me, that didn't take away from the brilliance of the script and the message that comes across for it. I weep every single time in the same
spot. For that, Naiad. Nominations for Annette Bening. That was a terrific movie. You want a message about women empowerment. If that's what you're looking for, that's a fantastic movie.
What I can also do is just watch Barbie that I bought it. So I'm just going to buy it. I bought it and I'll just watch that. But anyway, this is not what your column is about. Your column says award shows like the Oscars are doomed. I feel like I've heard this one before.
Yeah, so, all the award shows, Oscars, Emmys, Golden Globes, the audiences have been dropping precipitously over the past decade. It used to be that an Oscar night would be 40 million viewers, and then it became about 30s. Now it's down to, if they get 10, 12, then they're lucky. Last year, there was a little bit of an uptick. I think a lot of people sort of basically dialed in to see if there'd be a repeat of Will Smith's slap on Chris Rock. There wasn't a slap. This year, ironically, the nominations are going to get a lot of buzz for the reasons we've just been talking about. Because Margot Robbie gets snubbed, because Greta Gerwig gets snubbed. There'll be a lot of buzz around the nominations, but for those exact same reasons, I suspect fewer people will watch the actual Oscars. It's too long. It's, there's just too much sort of pomp and circumstance and very little actual content. And most people will consume the highlights on YouTube and on TikTok, on
That's not what the ABC television network wants to hear. Because that's historically these events, which the former CEO of CBS would call wow events, that's what brings in huge advertising dollars. So that's just another emblematic of the overall issue of TV cord cutting and so on.
They'll sell out the ads. They sold out the ads last year as well, but at a lower rate. So that's something that they need to worry about. If sufficient numbers of people will tune in, that advertisers will still remain interested in the event, but for progressively or smaller and smaller amounts of money.
And here goes this. This is the sales pitch that broadcast and cable television have been making to Madison Avenue for 30 years.
Yeah.
Okay, here's the pitch.
I'm ready.
I'm going to give you an inferior product to what I gave you last year. I'm going to charge you more.
That's not going this way anymore.
And it works every single year.
Wait, so they're charging more for this space right now?
Every year, up until the last couple of years when cord cutting became so bad. But broadcast and cable television would say, yeah, I know my ratings are down because there's 500 more channels. But still, I have the biggest audience at CBS. Yes, it's half of what it was 10 years ago, but it's still bigger than anything else out there. Oh, by the way, for that, I'm going to charge you another 5, 6, 7, 8%. And that worked forever. Now the issue is...
Yeah, I don't think that can be sustained for very much longer.
We'll see. I don't know.
Yeah, I think, again,
unless you're the Super Bowl. If you're the Super Bowl, you can go out and say...
Sports is a different category.
Yeah.
But, sports... If you're a fan, you don't want to just watch the highlights. You want to watch the live performance. But with Oscars, with any award show, more and more people are quite happy just to see the highlights immediately after the award is announced. They don't want to watch the whole,
awkward moments.
The awkward moments, the songs, the skits. It seems like too much of a muchness.
That used to be must-watch television.
Really, I know.
It goes to John Tucker's The Whole World's Coming to an End.
Well, I would have Oscar parties. Literally, we'd do boats. We'd put in money. People walk home with a couple $100. Like it was like
Can
a
you
thing.
bet on the? I guess you can. Like.
With people in my home, sure. I mean, like in the reality of the world.
Maybe I might be into it. Then.
Maybe. But what I also wonder too is, do you think that these kind of live events will go the way of sports in different ways of viewing it? Like we saw WWE and Netflix, for example. Like would Paramount be like, hey, let's just air it streaming and save some, like, is that a thing?
Well, I think you'll probably, if the audience continues to shrink, they'll have to find new ways of making it relevant. In time, I think you'll see the duration of it shrink. I don't think a 3.5-hour program, which invariably goes closer to 4 hours, I don't think that's sustainable anymore. This year, they're bringing it forward. They're starting broadcast an hour early because they're conscious that in that last hour, past bedtime in the East Coast, a lot of people, the next day is a school day, lots of people just switch off. And that's a real problem for them. So they're bringing it forward to try and see if they can sort of juice the audience that way. I think you'll probably see certain amount of stunt casting in the people who are hosts or presenters. We've seen that happen in the Olympics, for instance. Olympic audiences have been down. NBC has been bringing in people like Snoop Dogg to try and get audiences interested. I say, okay, let's have a switch and get some Olympic performers to present the Oscars. I'll watch Simone Biles.
Well, ABC doesn't have the rights. ABC doesn't have the rights to the Olympics, so you're not.
That's true, but you can bring an athlete in. So
yep, exactly. Well, that's a good thing. I mean, you're bringing in athletes to just some stunt hosting.
I think you'll see progressively more and more desperate attempts to try and hold on to that audience, but I think that ship has sailed.
What else are you working on right now? What else catches your eye?
Well, the culture is a very, very sort of large beat, and there's a big tent, and there are lots of different aspects to it. I'm sort of taking a nibble of the food, some food stuff, no pun intended. I'm trying to wrap my head around the evolution of the entertainment business. Just this fact that it's becoming more and more sort of desegregated, and you can't rely on the old tentpole events and on the old ways of watching and consuming entertainment. People are watching entire movies in segments on TikTok. That just, my head explodes at the thought of that. Can you watch an entire movie 2 minutes at a time? But people are doing that. I've written about that in the past, and that's very interesting to me. Just to sort of come back to the Oscars, that slap that we were talking about. Within 24 hours of that slap, 50 million people had watched it on YouTube. It broke the existing YouTube record. 50 million people. How many people watched it on ABC? 12 million people.
So have we become less cultured?
I don't think we're less cultured, but certainly...
I want you to come up with an index like the Dow or the S&P 500, the culture index.
Okay.
I don't know what components will go into it, telling us, are we less or more cultured?
I think our attention span has certainly been greatly reduced in part because there's just so much competing for our attention, and Hollywood and the theaters have been taking for granted for years that we will go in and watch a movie, 2.5 hours at a stretch. In the case of some of this year's big blockbusters, 3.5 hours at a stretch. But I think fewer and fewer people are going to do that. That's just too long.
It is. I mean, that's what I think the big issue is. And you talk to the filmmakers in Hollywood, and they're frustrated like crazy because they feel like the art form of cinema is dying. And so, but then you get Martin Scorsese, who I think goes the other extreme with his film.
That's because he's Martin Scorsese.
Yeah. That's right. And I walked out of the theater saying, Martin Scorsese took me for granted. He made a 3.5-hour movie when it very well could have been a 2-hour movie. I loved the movie. I loved the actors, but I did not have a good experience. If I saw him on the street right then, I said, did not.
So did Christopher Nolan. Oppenheimer was like 17 hours.
I know.
Yeah. It didn't have to
not
be.
really.
The interesting thing though, here's the weird thing. We're perfectly happy to spend an entire day binge watching a TV series.
Yes. Yep.
So 8 hours, 9 hours at a stretch, just breaking for lunch and bathroom breaks. But we don't want to watch 3.5 hours in the cinema.
Yeah.
So Hollywood has to wrap its head around that.
So why is that? Is that what John Tucker's saying, that we're all just getting dumber?
I don't think we're getting dumber. I think some stories are better told in the long format. This idea of binge watching is relatively new. The opportunity didn't exist before. And I think a lot of really intelligent directors are taking to that, recognizing that that's where we live now. That's where there is appetite now. And if that means that we make fewer movies and more interesting, long-running television shows, then so be it.
I just think that people can you get on your Instagram Reels, you look down, you look up, it's 3 hours later.
Yeah, well, that's a rabbit hole.
Out of control. I mean, and for somebody who I'm sensitive to that stuff, I don't want to get anywhere near that. It happens. And so imagine if you're sitting in Hollywood and you're like, wait a minute, this knucklehead just got entertained rapidly for 3 hours on user-generated content and just garbage. What happened to the $200 million movie I just made? You know, that's kind of the big issue. Bobby Ghosh, we were talking more about this with Bobby Ghosh.
You just made John Tucker cry.
I know. It's just, but he feels passionately about this whole dumbing down of America, and there's a lot of data to support it, quite frankly. So, Bobby Ghosh, thanks so much for joining us here. Looking at the markets here again, we've got the Dow up about 0.3%, but that's about it. Not a lot of movement out there. We'll have more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Major averages, they've just all turned lower right now. Not a lot of movement in terms of percentage basis. We did get a slew of earnings today. That's in the driver's seat right now. And it's kind of instructive to look at the Dow Jones Industrial Average for the results. Best performing members, Verizon and Procter & Gamble. Verizon up 5.5%. Procter & Gamble, that's up 4.2%. The worst performing members, 3M and Johnson & Johnson, Look at 3M right now, down over 11% at this point. China also in the news. U.S.-listed China shares gaining after Bloomberg reported Beijing considering a big package of measures to stabilize their falling stock market. And then finally, in the crypto space, Bitcoin has fallen over 20% since the January 11th launch of the first ETFs. Speculators becoming a little more cautious about the potential impact of the products. Again, S&P 500 lower, down just 3 points. The Dow 155 points lower. The NASDAQ 100 is right now down 7 points. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Alex and Paul.
John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Alex Steele, Paul Sweeney, live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio, streaming live on YouTube. So head over to youtube.com, search Bloomberg Radio. A new Boston Globe Suffolk University poll released Tuesday suggests Trump was the bigger beneficiary of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' decision to drop out of the race Sunday. Trump now leads Haley by 22 points, up 3 points from the same poll on Saturday. Let's figure out what's going on up there in Iowa. Jody Schneider, political news director for Bloomberg TV and Radio. Jody, if I'm in the Nikki Haley camp, what's a good day for me today? Just not getting squished? I mean, what are they saying?
Well, they need to have at least a very strong second place showing. Obviously, they want to win. If they win, it would be a big upset, and that would change the nature of this race going forward. If they have a strong second, she can say that she was competitive to Donald Trump and make that case. But anything after first place would be a question of when and if and when she should drop out. The inevitability of Donald Trump has been the story here. Is it inevitable? Can she unseat that? And we'll know tonight. But second, of course, is second, and she was third in Iowa. And going into South Carolina, all of that would not be what she wants and what she needs. Because South Carolina in another month is going to be a critical race. She's already behind Trump there, and that's her home state. It could be a very bruising few weeks if she chooses to stay in, and could be an embarrassing defeat. So that'll really be the question after tonight.
Jody?
We'll see how she does, and if she doesn't do really well, is she going to leave the race?
Jody, what is the vibe on the ground for voters? Usually in Trump counties, for example, the support is so passionate. For New Hampshire, that overwhelmingly has so many independents, like, is there passion for Nikki Haley? Is there passion for Donald Trump? Is there passion for Joe Biden? What's your read?
Well, there's certainly among Trump supporters, there is a lot of passion. Those rallies are quite passionate, as they are typically for Trump rallies. For Nikki Haley, a lot of these folks who we've talked to and we've gone to her rallies are about not voting for Donald Trump, that they just can't vote for Donald Trump and they're looking for something else. They like her. I think there is support for her vision, that it's younger, it's fresher. She's not somebody who has been, in office, in part of the Washington machine, that kind of thing. She was a governor. She was the ambassador to the UN. I think a problem for her, she didn't hit Trump hard enough until late in the campaign. And so a lot of people wonder, well, why are you running if he's okay? But who she will do well with are these independent voters. As much as 40% of the electorate here are what they call undeclared or independent voters. And you can, if you are an independent, you can vote in this primary. And that's who she's hoping to do really well with. Also, New Hampshire's a state that has confounded the odds before. They have, they are notorious for surprises, and the people here really like that. So if she was going to do that anywhere, here would be the place.
Jody, if you get to the, you talk to people, the RNC, the Republican National Committee, do they believe Trump can beat Biden?
I think they certainly do. I think they're you know, they are looking at Biden as somebody with low approval ratings and somebody who there's not a lot of enthusiasm for. Now, there's an enthusiasm gap, I think, on both sides, but the question is, can they try to rally enough of their voters? It'll be a turnout game if it's a Trump versus Biden ticket, which it's increasingly looking like it will be. It really will be, can you turn out those voters? Can you turn out enough voters, and particularly in those key swing states? That's what it will come down to if this is the ticket.
Jody, what I find interesting is what voters are voting on. You mentioned voting for Nikki Haley because she's not Trump versus like loving her. We know that voters are extremely worried about the economy, but you take a look at, say, the University of Michigan survey last week, and they're slowly feeling better. Inflation expectations have come down. Expectations on current conditions really moving higher. What's your read on what's that number one thing that voters want to do?
Well, I think it's still the pocketbook issues, Alex. I mean, people, every time they go to the grocery store, they're reminded that they're paying more than they were, you know, a few years ago. Every time they fill up their gas tank, it's like a reminder. Even if the economy's doing better, they don't necessarily credit the person in the White House for that. They're faulting him for the fact that a couple of years ago they were paying less.
Like being a parent.
So I think that's a real issue for Joe Biden going forward.
Jody, does it matter who former President Trump may or may not select for his running mate here? Does anybody care?
I don't think it makes a bunch of difference. I mean, it used to. It used to be you would pick them from a different part of the country than you were from. You would, you know, obviously with John McCain picking Sarah Palin as a woman, they thought that would be a good move. But I think it matters less, though. I think that if Trump is the nominee, he will make this a long kind of process and make it dramatic. I think there will be quite a bit of speculation and intrigue with that. So it matters less. But again, the other thing that's going to happen here is if we know who the party, you know, what the matchup is, say, you know, maybe after tonight or certainly in early February, that's a long time for a general campaign. So the parties will be trying to do things that will, you know, get some voter enthusiasm, that will keep that voter attention. And the vice presidential sweepstakes on the Republican side will be one of those things.
Hey, Jody, do we know the financial condition of the Trump campaign? Because apparently there's some, you know, large donors out there who are not supportive of the former president. If this is going to be a long, drawn-out campaign, how is he set financially, do you think?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that is one thing that Joe Biden has really going for him. He has amassed a serious campaign war chest. And they haven't really begun to deploy that yet. One of the, you know, really one of the benefits of incumbency is, you know, you get coverage, right? Just by being president, you go out and give a speech and everybody covers it. We haven't really they haven't had to spend yet, and they have a very large war chest on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, I mean, you know, he has had, you know, unlimited coverage, Donald Trump, but he has not been able to necessarily get back some of those big donors that he had in 2020. And so that'll be a real question. Mm-hmm. Can they refill those coffers? I think there is some waiting on the sidelines to see if he is the nominee. And there was a lot of hope that among some of these donors that he might not be. They put their money elsewhere. But now, once he is the nominee, I think that will start to gravitate toward him. The other question, the other thing we haven't talked much about is third party, because this early on, with this kind of lack of enthusiasm for these two candidates among people in their own parties combined, you will see more talk of this third-party candidate, possible third-party candidacy, this no labels group that's sort of been waiting to see whether it is going to be Trump versus Biden. They may emerge with someone, or a third-party candidate may emerge himself or herself.
Jody, really appreciate it. Thank you so, so much. Jody Schneider, political news director for Bloomberg TV and Radio. It sounds like she's in a bar, like there's a party going on. I think the studio is actually in a big bar.
Is that right?
I think that's true, because you can see on the video there's like beer taps.
You know, when you used to cover the campaigns, you would, and it's no reflection on a bias on the part of reporters, but my experience was you would always want to cover the Democrats because they're the ones who always had the open bar.
Really?
Oh, really?
Republicans made you pay for everything.
Well, this all tracks. This completely tracks.
Self-explanatory now. So,
but I think what'll be interesting. Fun was a different word, but interesting is the rhetoric and the spin that comes out tomorrow, right? Yep. And sort of what the pundits wind up saying about who won, what winning is, what that looks like. And I'm really interested in big Wall Street money. Yep. What do they do? Do they really go behind Trump? Do they get more involved in the Senate, for example? They're clearly not going to go to Biden, so what do they do?
I know. It's interesting because, I mean, Nikki Haley has, as we've heard this morning, has a fundraising event coming up soon, which was going to have a lot of that big money. And if she's out of the race, where does that money go? So we'll have to see. So again, the primary up in New Hampshire as we speak. Bloomberg, full coverage. Joe Matthew and his team, 12 to 2 today.
Yep.
Then 5 to 6 p.m. These are all East Coast times. And then 8 to 10 p.m. tonight. So Joe Matthew, Kaylee Lines, and all the team there. They'll have it for you. So we are all over that stuff. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get world and national news with Amy Morris.
All right, thank you, Paul. Secretary of State Lloyd Austin made his first public appearance since he was hospitalized earlier this month, urging a meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group to, quote, dig deep and support Ukraine's forces in their battle against Russia.
Putin continues to sacrifice staggering numbers of Russian troops in his rash and reckless war of choice.
The defense secretary clearly speaking by video link there as he made the pitch aimed at Republican lawmakers. Israel has taken its worst single-day loss since its all-out assault on Hamas began in Gaza. Bloomberg's Ross Matheson says the question of hostages makes this conflict even more difficult.
We know there are conversations going on still involving Qatar and Egypt to try and negotiate a ceasefire to allow the release of more hostages, and it is a concern, but by and large the broad support is that either way that this conflict needs to continue to achieve what Israel sees as its necessary goals.
It's Bloomberg's Ross Matheson. It is primary day in New Hampshire. Bloomberg's Laura Davison says there's enthusiasm around both candidates.
Both Haley and Trump gave these very dramatic speeches last night, but he really sort of made the case and tried to project this air of inevitability that he would be the one to win in New Hampshire today and quickly seal up this nomination.
Bloomberg's Laura Davison in New Hampshire reporting President Biden gearing up for a general election campaign, focusing on one issue in particular, as we learned from Bloomberg's Jody Schneider, who is also in New Hampshire.
He's looking at basically mounting this fresh push on abortion rights, which is really part of the broader strategy to try to sharpen the contrast between the sitting president and Donald Trump.
Bloomberg's Jody Schneider reporting from Manchester, New Hampshire there, where President Biden, by the way, is not on the ballot after pushing Democrats to move their first primary to South Carolina. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. The major stock averages, they are all lower, not by much. The S&P 500 down just 4 points at 48.45. The Dow Jones Industrial Average 183 points lower. That's down 0.5%. The NASDAQ 100 down 19 points, a decline of about 0.1% right now. With the corporate earnings, they remain in focus today. By and large, we've seen estimates pretty much hold up for the year so far. United Airlines jumping on better than expected earnings, leading airline stocks higher. You have Verizon advancing after the telecom giant's guidance for this year impressed analysts. That is the best performer right now, the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Well, rate cuts aren't too far in the background. Michael Gapin at Bank of America Securities, he remains confident the Fed will cut rates as soon as March.
What gets them to cut in March is the inflation data. That even if the activity side of the economy is doing well, as it is, it's really the deceleration in inflation and the fact that we're 6 or 7 months with annualized core PCE running at 2% or less.
United Airlines Chief Executive Officer Scott Kirby criticizing Boeing's handling of manufacturing miscues. And he now says United reconsidering its order for the largest 737 MAX model, which already is years behind schedule. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Alex and Paul.
Okay, John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Alex Steele, Paul Sweeney. We are live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. We're streaming live on YouTube. Head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Radio. One of the big company news stories of the day, topical, is Netflix. It has acquired the exclusive rights to Raw, as well as other programming from World Wrestling Entertainment, marking the streaming service's first big move into live events. The streaming giant, big bucks here, has agreed to pay $5 billion over the course of the 10-year deal. Let's break this down with Geetha Ranganathan. She covers all the media stuff for Bloomberg Intelligence. She joins us via Zoom from the Bloomberg Intelligence headquarters in lovely Princeton, New Jersey. Geetha, this is a big move for Netflix here because they've kind of resisted getting into live events and sports and that kind of stuff. So what gives here?
Yeah, what gives, I think, Paul, is advertising. So they resisted advertising, too, for the longest time till they were kind of finally forced to bite the bullet and use advertising to kind of reinvigorate subscriber growth. And so far, I mean, it's worked, maybe not as much as they had hoped it would, which is why they kind of need to invest in their business in order to kind of really build that critical mass of, ad-supported users that, then they can sell kind of advertising to. And so I think this is really the real play here for Netflix is to chase those advertising dollars.
How much could it actually help? Like, what kind of numbers are we looking at? Like X amount of its revenue now that could be X amount in 5 years?
So right now, the revenue is de minimis, right? They launched the advertising tier in November of 2022, kind of had a really, really slow start. But the most recent number that they reported was 23 million monthly active users. So we think that translates roughly to about 12 million or 13 million subscribers on the ad platform. Ultimately, what we want to be able to see for scale, we know that Amazon Prime is actually launching, I think just in a few days, they're kind of launching video ads on Prime Video. And the audience right off the bat that they've kind of cited to advertisers is 115 million. Wow. So what you really kind of want to see is 50 million, 100 million. That is really kind of the captive audience, the critical mass that we're looking for. In terms of how much can advertising potentially be, so right now Netflix is about a $35-40 billion business. I think if it takes off in a big way, probably in the next 2 years, I wouldn't be surprised if advertising made up about 10 to 15% of Netflix's revenue.
Yeah, that's a lot. So, Geetha, is this maybe the first step, dipping the toe in the pool of maybe becoming a bigger player in sports overall? That, again, they've kind of resisted and been very adamant about they don't have an interest in sports, maybe because of the price tag. But is this maybe the first opportunity here?
I definitely think so. So yes, they have spoken about the price tag. Again, this is, definitely a hefty price tag. It's $5 billion over a span of 10 years. So they're spending $500 million a year. But again, they're not necessarily betting the farm, right? Because if we wanted to see Netflix do something transformative, it would have to be like maybe buying a gaming studio, which would be upwards of, 15, 20, $30 billion, or maybe just buying a film studio, again, which would be a huge price tag. Of course, sports rights are also expensive. This kind of, I think, allows them to dip their toes a little bit. It's still $500 million. It's not some crazy number like, what some of the other big media giants are paying for sports rights. You look at Disney, they're paying upwards of $10 billion just for all of the sports rights that they have. So I think relatively it's a way for them to kind of experiment, test the waters, see how it plays out. And then remember, on that 10-year deal with TKO, they do have an option after 5 years to kind of walk away from the deal if they're not happy with how it's playing out for them.
But still, I mean, for TKO, like, it's kind of double what they were getting with regular cable. So how much is the content spend concern worth to the share price of Netflix?
Oh, definitely. Content spend, I think, is definitely going to be one of those, worrisome factors for Netflix. But having said that, okay, so they have said that they're going to spend $17 billion this year on content. Obviously, it's probably going to go up to about $20 billion over the next couple of years. But then look at their free cash flow profile. They're throwing out $6.5 billion in free cash flow in 2023. That probably goes to about $10 billion in the next few years. So they do have a lot of cash at their disposal. They did say that they're going to buy back shares, but we also want to see them invest in their business. And so this is a great way that they're investing in their business. Ultimately, I think to build up their advertising business, it's not just content. They're going to have to invest in their tech stack, in their ad tech stack a little bit more, to kind of really get more traction and more scale.
All right, Geetha, let's step back a little bit on the streaming business here. You just, threw out some big free cash flow numbers, which, boy, I remember the days when they had negative free cash flow and they were just trying to get the positive free cash flow. How about the other competitors out there? What's the feeling? We're 2, 3, 4 years into this whole streaming business here. Is there room for other players here? How do you think this might shake out?
Yeah, Paul, I think, the streaming wars are definitely over at this point, and we know the winner is Netflix. They've just completely decimated the competition, if you will, whether it's in terms of subscriber growth, but more importantly, subscriber growth doesn't really, it's important, but it's not the be all and the end all. What the street is really focused now on is the financial side of things, is the profitability metrics, and Netflix has kind of absolutely blown it out of the park. And so as we kind of look at, what we're kind of trying to see is the margin profile. So right now, if you look at Netflix's streaming business, it's a 20% operating margin, but they have committed to about 300 basis points of average annual increase. So just push that out another 3-4 years. Very soon, we could be seeing upwards of 30% operating margins. Can any of the other players, like a Disney, like a Warner Brothers Discovery, replicate that? They did have those margins in their cable TV business. Unfortunately, in the streaming business, it's going to be a really, really long haul. We do think that they could potentially maybe get to, 10%, 15%, but it's going to take them a very, very long time. And who knows how the whole landscape is going to shift by that time.
Paul, how do you watch stuff?
Kind of, the only stuff I watch really is sports.
Okay.
And then I will stream some stuff.
But do you still have traditional cable then to watch the sports?
Yes, for the broadband and for the sports.
Okay. But if you can get sports on streaming, would you cut the cord?
Well, I need broadband access.
Oh, sure.
So, yeah.
But you can get just that.
Yeah, that's right. And that's basically what it would be. And Geetha, the cord cutting, I was going to Alex's question, where are we there in terms of cord cutting?
It's bad. It's really bad, Paul.
If Paul's even talking the words, that feels bad.
It's close to an 8 to 9% erosion. And just to kind of give you some context here, back in the day, Paul, when you were kind of covering the space very actively, it was 104 million pay TV households. Right now, we're down to about 70 million. And and kind of the outlook is we're probably going to go to 50 million in the next couple of years. Wow. And then who knows where we're headed after that.
That's a tough business. All right, Geetha, thank you so much for joining us. Always feel a little bit smarter after checking in with you. Geetha Ranganathan, she covers all the TMT space for Bloomberg Intelligence. She's based in our headquarters in Princeton, New Jersey, joining us via Zoom. And that is a tough erosion to what was a phenomenal business model. When every household was paying its $80 or $90 a month, everybody in Hollywood was making money. those times have changed. We're going to have more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
Company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
And I'm John Tucker, the Bloomberg Newsroom. We'll look at some of the company news. Let's start with Verizon getting a pop today. In fact, it's one of the best performing stocks in the Dow Jones Industrial Average. They added the most mobile phone customers in a couple of years. A turnaround story here. Verizon's consumer group adding 318,000 mobile subscribers in the period. The Verizon had fallen behind its wireless peers in subscriber growth for years. And then 3M, worst performing stock in the Dow, maker Post-it notes, among other things, posting earnings. 2024 profits and sales growth they sell will fall short of estimates. 3M began slashing thousands of jobs. That was part of the restructuring push that helped lift profit margins and cash generation in the second half of last year. But now they say broader economic environment, that does look like it remains muted at this point. And New Brunswick, New Jersey, Johnson & Johnson opening its books this morning. They say fourth quarter earnings beat analyst estimates. Sales in the drug and medical device units exceeded analyst expectations. But the shares, they fell. The CFO there said pharma sales is going to be lower in the second half of this year on declining sales of Stelara. That is their psoriasis drug. And, of course, you heard from Gita at Netflix laying the smackdown on the streaming war for live events, cutting a 10-year, $5 billion deal with World Wrestling Entertainment to stream WWE Raw, if you know what that is, in the U.S., and every other WWE event outside the United States, and that starts next year. The president, Nick Khan, says this is about growing a global audience for sports and entertainment, as he calls it. The parent of WWE TKO surging on this news today. And that is your company news. I'm John Tucker.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, looking at this market right here, we do have the Dow off 180 points. That's about 0.5%, but the S&P and NASDAQ pretty much unchanged on the day. Yields a little bit higher, 10-year Treasury. It's only about 4 basis points. Let's call it 4.14% on your 10-year Treasury. WTI crude oil off just slightly here, $74.50. And gold up slightly, $2,025 per ounce. Bitcoin off 1.5%, 39,200 on Bitcoin. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get world and national news with Amy Morris.
All right, thank you, Paul. The Biden administration has allowed more than 1 million migrants to live in the United States using what is known as humanitarian parole. Texas Republican Congressman Mike McCall says that's got to stop.
Need to go back to remain in Mexico, and that we got to push the border out and stop playing defense on the 1 yard line.
Researchers at Syracuse said the number of migrants with pending immigration cases is now larger than the population of Chicago. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis may have endorsed Donald Trump, but he says he is ready to veto a proposal that would help pay Trump's mounting legal fees. Florida's chief financial officer has proposed a bill that would create a Freedom Fighters Fund to provide up to $5 million in financial support to help defray some of Trump's legal bills. Oppenheimer, is leading the Academy Awards race with 13 nominations. Barbie, which was the summer's biggest box office hit, was nominated for 8 awards, including Best Picture. And for the first time ever, the Associated Press got a nod for 20 Days in Mariupol.
The war has begun, and we have to tell its story.
Got a Best Documentary nomination. The Oscars will be held March 10th in Los Angeles. Hundreds of sea turtles that had to be rescued from that nasty winter blast last week down in Texas, they're being released back into the wild.
All sea turtles are either endangered or threatened under the Endangered Species Act. So when you're dealing with the population like that, every individual matters.
Jesse Gilbert heads the Texas State Aquarium, says they've spent days getting the little turtles all warm again. And research from Gallup puts a price tag on workplace unhappiness. Disgruntled employees, they say, cost U.S. companies an estimated $1.9 trillion in lost productivity last year. 1/3 of respondents said they are engaged at their jobs. Half are giving just minimal effort. You know what they call that, quiet quitting. Global news 24 hours a day, whenever you want it, with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. Paul and Alex.
Amy Morris, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Boy, the United Airlines CEO, he's not happy with Boeing. United CEO exploring MAX 10 alternatives after Boeing misstep. So United Airlines Holdings Chief Executive Officer Scott Kirby criticized Boeing's handling of manufacturing miscues and said the carrier is reconsidering its order for the largest 737 MAX model, which is already years behind schedule. United has already started to build an alternative plan that doesn't have the MAX 10 in it, Kirby said, adding that would probably entail changes to the airline's order book. And he made an interesting point here in our reporting. United CEO blamed a culture at Boeing that predates the era of current Boeing CEO David Calhoun, dating to the company's 1997 merger with defense giant McDonnell Douglas.
Yeah.
That's like 30 years ago.
I mean, that'd be really bad. Like if you cancel orders, because a lot of these guys lock in orders like years and years in advance because it takes so long to get these planes. So to get out of the queue and then have to go to the end of the line to an Airbus queue to get the planes, like that would be a really big deal. I guess I wonder how much capacity they have with their current planes and how usable they'll be for how long. That will probably help to dictate that decision. Or is this just like the bluster? Basically, to push Boeing to do something different? I don't know.
Well, it's interesting. The reporting here in the Bloomberg story, the public airing, going to your point, the public airing of frustrations by Boeing's largest customer is unusual in an industry where rifts between trade partners are typically discussed and resolved in private. Well, Kirby said a resolution was in sight for ending the MAX 9 grounding. He warned that United was losing patience with the delays that seemed to follow in certifying the larger MAX 10 as U.S. regulators step up their scrutiny of Boeing.
I feel like there's a line to be made from Amy Morris's story about the disgruntled employees to, I don't know. I feel like there's something that we can glean on this from like a survey of disgruntled employees to Boeing and United.
Exactly. I don't know. My personal opinion on the whole Boeing issue is they never should have left Seattle. They never should have left the corporate headquarters, moved from Seattle. My engineer friend didn't like it. All right, Balance of Power with Joe Matthew. That comes up right now.
business. This is Balance of Power.
It's finally here, the first in the nation primary. Welcome to the fastest show in politics, live from Manchester, as voting gets underway here in a contest that could decide the Republican nominee for president as soon as tonight. We'll have the latest polling for you over the course of this hour, along with insights from the most important political voices in the Granite State in the next 2 hours here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube. A conversation as well with Democratic presidential candidate Dean Phillips. It's all ahead after we get a look at Wall Street. We'll do that right now in New York with Charlie Pellet. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Joe Matthew. Day 2 in the new time slot. We have got the Dow trading lower, S&P, NASDAQ both higher. Truth be told, though, S&P little changed right now. Let's call that unchanged on the day. We've got the NASDAQ Composite Index higher by 6, up by about 0.1%. NASDAQ 100 also little changed, while the S&P down now by 0.5 point. Dow Industrials down 169, drop there of 0.5%. 10-year yield 4.14%, with a 2-year right now 4.40%. As Joe mentioned, voting underway in New Hampshire. But what about voters and the economic backdrop? Carl Riccadonna is chief economist at BNP Paribas. He was interviewed this morning on Bloomberg Surveillance.
Tying into today's events in New Hampshire, and as we think about the presidential cycle, there's weak economic sentiment from the public, but I think that over the course of this year, as it becomes more apparent that inflation has moderated, and it becomes more apparent that the labor market is still on a relatively healthy footing, this economic messaging, I think, is going to play favorably into incumbent politicians, most importantly, the top of the ticket.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. A lot of earnings out today. RTX Corp up now by 5.7%. It is forecasting 2024 profit that topped Wall Street expectations as the aerospace and defense giant ramps up work on a costly recall of its top-selling jet engine. Also out with earnings this morning, GE, and it is predicting profit that will fall short of Wall Street's expectations as the manufacturer continues to see a disparity between its growing aerospace operations and a recovering energy business. GE down now by 1.5%. After the bell today, of course, we will be hearing from Netflix. Netflix up now by 0.2%. Gold up 0.2%, 20.25 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude, little changed, up 3 cents right now, 74.78 a barrel. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, we thank you. Back to Manchester here, where we've been on the ground for several days. It's actually time to vote. What a great feeling after talking about polling for weeks and months. All the speculation and the prognosticating will not matter by the end of this day. The polls close beginning at 7. They do it a little bit differently in New Hampshire. The final polls will close at 8. And we expect a pretty early call from everyone we're talking to here. We have the latest on-the-ground polling in this rolling poll by Suffolk University that's they've been working with the Boston Globe and USA Today. It's not looking good for Nikki Haley. Remember, this is the poll that had them in, within 10 points a week ago, and Donald Trump just hit 60% for the first time in this poll. Nikki Haley at 38%. We've got 22 delegates on the line. And look, New Hampshire's known for surprises. That's partly why we are here. And this is also where we begin our conversation with Bloomberg's Lauren Dzinski, who used to do this for a living. It's great to see you in Manchester, just like the old days. And the times that you spent covering the State House in Massachusetts, you covered Charlie Brown, you covered a guy named Scott Brown, who we talked to here last night. I just wonder, Lauren, your thoughts on where the Republican Party is and where it's turning here in New England. We've been talking so much about independents who are going to make up this decision. Where are the demographics now compared to a Republican Party that elected Charlie Baker?
That's a really good question. I think when we talk about New England conservative voters, we often think of the flinty Republican from New Hampshire.
Sure.
And, it's really, I think, what it comes down to tonight is a gauge of, is this still the party of Donald Trump? He won New Hampshire in 2016. In 2020, is he going to do it again tonight? And I think if you look at Charlie Baker, the nation's most popular governor at the time, who was a Republican, despite that, didn't seek a third term in office. There's a number of reasons why he didn't run for re-election in Massachusetts, but it's also because he couldn't win a Republican primary in his own state. And I think those demographics kind of bear out in the state just north of Massachusetts, which is New Hampshire, which is where we are right now.
And they share a lot of folks, right? Conservatives who work in Boston, who've moved to New Hampshire for the more favorable taxes or whatever policy it is that turn them on or off in one state or the other. There are a lot of folks who are considered Massachusetts natives, or I guess former residents, who are going to be making these decisions here in New Hampshire. So how do you put that all together? Is this the same New Hampshire that elected Donald Trump in 2016?
I mean, I think if anything, this is even more so the New Hampshire that elected Donald Trump in 2016.
Okay. It's Trumpier is what you mean.
Yeah, and I think it's also, it lends itself to the Trump campaign. The Trump campaign is better organized and better run than it was in 2016. Even in Iowa, you know, you had the Trump caucus captain hats that were gold and white that were an absolute asset. That wasn't happening in 2016. And the same thing is true in New Hampshire. Last night, Donald Trump did a rally in, I believe, Laconia, which is quite far north. And he admitted when he was at his rally that, you know, my advisors recommended that I come all the way up here to speak to you guys. And, you know, he talked about how he had all these supporters packed into a room. It speaks to not only the steadfast, and as we've seen in that latest Boston Globe poll, the building support that Trump has, but also just the resiliency of it all and the attention by the Trump campaign in recognizing that New Hampshire is a fertile ground, even though Nikki Haley barnstormed the state. And how is that going to work out for her?
Well, it starts making you wonder if the New Hampshire primary is still the New Hampshire primary.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sentiment here, having been on the ground in 2016, it's a different vibe. Also, that has to do with the Democrats not, you know, Joe Biden is not on the ballot this time around, and so there's the whole write-in campaign or whatever. Also, many Massachusetts electeds will have a hand in trying to have Joe Biden not suffer an embarrassing defeat.
Yes, right. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah.
Dean Phillips thinks he can embarrass Joe Biden. That's a whole other storyline here.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to jump
in terms
around.
of, not at all. While you're with us, and you're going to be running headlines on the terminal tonight, right? The people need to know this is the person behind the curtain. When you hear the news break later on, are we going to get an early call?
Listen, I'm no betting woman. However, I think it's very likely that if we see Trump perform the way that we have seen the polls show, I think we're going to get a pretty early call for Trump.
Polls close at 8.
Polls close at 8.
Some say 8:01. You're going to know who won, but we'll find out. About
I mean, listen, you'll
know
when the headline crosses the terminal.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining. Come talk to me sometime in Washington. You're always welcome here. Lauren Dazinski with us here on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew in Manchester, and we're going to get an update now on things in the field from Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who's been watching the polls since things opened fairly early this morning. Tyler, what are the stakes in this election today?
Hey, Joe. Well, as you've mentioned, voting is well underway. I'm starting to see people walk around downtown Manchester with the I voted stickers. That's how you know we're in the thick of it. Like you mentioned, polls are going to start closing at 7 p.m. The last polls will remain open until 8 p.m. Now, to put this into context for you, there are 22 delegates at stake in New Hampshire tonight, but that's less than 1% of what's needed for the Republican primary. But New Hampshire's first in the nation primary status means that all eyes are going to be on this race tonight, especially as the contest begins to winnow. Now, I know that both you and I are also going to be watching for the independent vote. This is an open primary, and independent voters make up the largest share of New Hampshire voters at 39%. Now, the polling and the strategists are telling us that this is the needle that Nikki Haley is trying to thread with these more moderate independent voters. But we have to remember, in 2016, former President Trump handedly won independents in the 2016 New Hampshire primary. It ultimately helped to win the state by 20 percentage points. The chair of the New Hampshire Republican Party says that that is the narrative he's going to be watching, that these independent voters are former President Trump's to lose. He's also going to be watching for turnout. And I can tell you from the voters I've spoken to here on the ground, there's a lot of enthusiasm for getting out tonight for both for and against the former president.
All right, Tyler Kendall, we thank you, and we'll meet you a little bit later on Balance of Power. Tyler will be with us for the duration, and that's our plan. We've got many hours of programming coming to you live here from Manchester today, here on Balance of Power on the radio and on YouTube, later on Bloomberg TV, and special coverage tonight that will begin at 8 p.m. Manchester time, if I can say that, at least for today, as we add the voice of Lizzie Guyton now, a voice of experience, having run Scott Brown's campaign for Senate here in Massachusetts, but also represented Governor Charlie Baker, the aforementioned governor of Massachusetts. Lizzie, it's great to see you. You're at South and Hill Strategies now, a co-founder, Republican strategist, and the first person we called when we knew we were coming up to Manchester. Thanks for making your way north. You're like those voters we were just talking about. You live in Massachusetts, but New Hampshire is also your backyard, and in some cases, these voters who go to work every day in Mass live here. And I wonder how you describe the demographics that we're talking about, because they're constantly changing. And when you look back to 2016, that might not be the best guide.
That's right. And right now, 40% of the electorate is unenrolled, and they all have the ability to go pull a ballot today. These are good conditions for Nikki Haley to not only pull Republicans and independents that are looking for an alternative to Trump, but there also could be some independents that are looking to an alternative to President Biden, who has snubbed the Granite State for the primary.
So talk to me more about this elusive independent vote. People not from here are hearing about it, these undeclareds. Who are these people? Where are they from? What are the demographics like? Is it what Donald Trump says, that they're kind of Democrats in disguise who want to go in and infiltrate this process with a protest vote? Are these Republicans who are looking for an alternative, or is it somewhere in between?
I think they're a little bit of everything. And I think in the age of, Biden and Trump, you're seeing more unenrolled voters because people are sick of the extremes on both sides. Most people are in the middle. And it's the extremism that's a big turnoff to this political process. So I think that you're seeing people from the left, from the right, and frankly, people that just don't want to have a political label. And they're looking for, a fresh start, a different candidate that's going to bring an alternative to the table that's not Trump or Biden.
So talk to me about the narrative here, because I've been here for a few days, and I'm hearing that there's disappointment. Debates were canceled. Not all the networks showed up this time. I wonder if you think that feeds into a potentially lower turnout, but also this sense of inevitability. I thought New Hampshire was supposed to be the place that brought surprises.
Well, it is, but this is also a state where there's a lot of value in retail politics. Residents expect to see the candidates to be able to shake their hand, ask them questions.
And the front runner never even came here, did a couple rallies.
Right, and is not doing the type of retail politicking that Granite Staters expect. Not to mention even President Biden. I mean, he hasn't stepped foot in the state since 22.
How about that?
So I think that but politics is also different now. I think it's not everybody's expecting to meet a candidate and spend time with them, but they're looking for someone that is going to talk to New Hampshire voters, that's going to show that, they have a new approach. And Granite Staters like to think for themselves. They don't like to be influenced by Washington.
So you don't think this is done, right? No one's counted a vote yet, and you've got people writing about the inevitable nomination of Donald Trump.
Sure. I mean, not only do Trump Republicans want to see a Trump nomination, but I think Democrats also want to see a Trump nomination, because I don't think President Biden wants to go up against a more moderate Republican like Nikki Haley.
Yeah. So you do think that is right, that the Biden camp thinks it can beat Donald Trump and would be at risk facing a Nikki Haley? Because we've got swing state polling at Bloomberg, and we're not the only ones showing that Joe Biden might have a hard time beating Donald Trump, too.
Yeah, and it's, an unknown. Trump is a known quantity for Biden and for Democrats, and Nikki Haley is different, right? She's an alternative to what we've seen for the past 8 years.
How important is this Chris Sununu endorsement? We talked to the governor over the weekend, the most coveted endorsement in New Hampshire. Has it been a difference maker for her? This was supposed to be Nikki Haley country.
I think it's a good endorsement to have. Chris Sununu is a really popular governor, and again, he's appealing to not just Republicans, but he's been supported by voters on all sides. And I think that there's a trust in him in the Granite State that they do take what he says to heart. But, you know, it's really interesting, like how much clout does an endorsement hold these days is an interesting question. And I think part of it is really just that New Hampshire voters like to think for themselves.
Yeah, right. We're spending time with Republican strategist Lizzie Guyton here on Bloomberg's Balance of Power. As I mentioned, you were a spokesperson for Governor Charlie Baker. Yep. At the time, the most popular governor in the United States of America. Many folks thought he might be the future of the party. How do we get this guy to run for president? But if you had done that, he wouldn't have been able to clear a primary. He may well have won a general election. So where does that say about where we are now versus 2016?
I think it's hard for any moderate in a primary setting, and I think that goes for both Republicans and Democrats.
Isn't that a problem for democracy?
I think it's a challenge, and I think, you know, even for a candidate like Nikki Haley, who, you know, is certainly looking to get some momentum here in New Hampshire to carry on, her margins should always expected to be tight in primaries because she is more of a moderate candidate than, you know, some would say Trump is, and then a conservative choice.
Where are you going to be looking tonight? You've helped to run a Senate campaign here in New Hampshire, and you have a sense of geography and demographics. Where should we have our eyes when the polls close?
I think the counties where Governor Kasich did well are ones to watch for Nikki Haley. And, you know, I know everyone's saying 801, but some of the bigger voting precincts will take a little bit more time to come in. And I think those will be, especially if there's good turnout and there's a lot of independents that go out and vote today, those are going to be where you're going to want to watch for Haley to have some good numbers.
Are you pushing us back on an early call? Do you think this might take a minute?
It might take a minute. I don't think we're going to be, you know,
maybe that's the surprise,
midnight,
if she's doing better than expected.
Yeah, just we got to wait for some of those bigger returns to come in New Hampshire, I would say.
You saw the Suffolk numbers I started with here. Trump's at 60% now. Do you believe it?
I think we got to give it the day. I think it's too early to make any conclusions.
I keep hearing New Hampshire people like messing with pollsters. That's why I ask you. They love.
Look, we also put a lot of stock in polls these days,
Sure.
you know, and I also would say we have to keep in mind in the past 7 days, the landscape of this primary has changed dramatically with Christie dropping out, Vivek, and then DeSantis. So even if we are leaning heavily on the polls, there hasn't been that much polling that's just a Haley-Trump matchup.
Yeah, that's true enough. And you wonder where those final DeSantis votes go. Sure. I think we know where the Christie votes went based on her trajectory recently. What a great pleasure to see you, Lizzie Guyton. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us at South and Hill Strategies, a firm that you co-founded, and I hope everything is well for you. Stay in touch with us here at Bloomberg. Absolutely. I'm Joe Matthew in Manchester, New Hampshire, and we do thank you for being with us here on Balance of Power, with a lot more to follow, including our conversation with Democratic presidential candidate Dean Phillips. It's next. This is Bloomberg.
headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index now trading in the red. Russell 2000 as well. We begin there. The Russell 2000 down by 0.6%. Small cap shares moving lower. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all retreating from records. Stocks, however, are trading in a narrow range ahead of a slew of company results that could offer insights about the state of the global economy. After the bell, of course, today we'll be hearing from Netflix. Right now, the S&P is down 2 points, drop there of just about 0.1%. The Dow lower by 167 points, drop there of 0.3%. And NASDAQ, the composite index, lower, little change, down 6 right now, a drop of less than 0.1%. 10-year yield 4.14%, with a 2-year that is now yielding 4.40%. Spot gold higher, little changed, up $2 the ounce, up by about 0.1%. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil now lower by 0.4%, 74.44 barrel. Lots of earnings. Procter & Gamble shares up now by 4.6%. The maker of Bounty paper towels and Downy fabric softener reported quarterly sales that did fall short of estimates. Consumers, though, continue to buy fewer items amid higher prices, but P&G up now by 4.4%. Verizon Communications added new retail mobile customers for the first time after 3 down quarters. Verizon shares, they're up now by 5.6%. Again, recapping, U.S. stocks are trading lower, with the S&P down now by 3 points, a drop there of less than 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pellett. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
This is Balance of Power with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
We're here to cover the Republican primary, of course, in New Hampshire, but there is a Democrat traveling the state, knocking on doors and trying to make some noise here. That would be Congressman Dean Phillips. He's running against Joe Biden in a primary that doesn't actually matter. Things get a bit complicated here, but after they changed the schedule, the objection by New Hampshire, it led the DNC to a decision to not recognize the delegates here. So Joe Biden is not campaigning, certainly in person, and he's not acknowledging the challenge, if we can call it that, from Dean Phillips. We talked about his long shot campaign in a sit down with myself and my partner, Kaylee Lyons, who will be here, of course, next hour. And Kaylee started by asking him about his claim that Joe Biden is a danger to democracy, whether his campaign that's underway right now is, in fact, a danger to Joe Biden. Here he is.
I'm simply calling attention to the very danger he's presenting to both his legacy, our party, and the country. To anybody who wishes to prevent another Donald Trump White House administration, we've got to wake up from this delusion that Joe Biden is an electable candidate. All the data show that he's not. Weakest approval numbers in, I think, American presidential history, 3 points below where Donald Trump was at the same point in his presidency, 9 points below Barack Obama as he approached his reelection. National polls, some show him a little bit ahead, but of course Democrats, because of the Electoral College, have to be way above that. But it's the battleground numbers that I encourage people to take a look at. 8 points down in Georgia. I think it's the same in Michigan. This is a tragedy just waiting to happen. I did not weaken in fact, to the contrary. I spent the last few years trying to help him, voting for his policies, being a member of House Democratic leadership to promote them. We all know what's going on in Washington. I think I'm just saying the quiet part out loud. I'm not weakening him. The party is choosing a coronation instead of the very competitions that our founders intended this country to be predicated upon.
They seem to upset a number of people in your party.
Yeah,
I spoke
good trouble.
Your colleague Annie Custer at this table over the weekend. She called your campaign ill-advised and unimpressive, and went on to say that she doesn't know what you're up to here in New Hampshire. So let's get to this, because it appears like this would be very difficult for you to win. What are you up to?
I'm up to practicing democracy, and I think elected officials, like my colleague Ms. Custer, should be doing the same thing. And this notion to condemn those who would have the audacity to actually do what we are supposed to do in this country, I think is appalling. It's one thing if President Biden was looking strong, where the country valued his reelection, where his numbers were rising, or at least in the 40s or 50s, if his battleground numbers were even, if not a little ahead. Remember, Hillary Clinton was ahead of Donald Trump in 2016. Everybody anticipated her victory. Donald Trump overperforms because the polls don't even measure his success. Ms. Custer, she can feel the way she wants. She called my campaign to my face unserious. I think she might be surprised tomorrow evening when she sees the number and sees an extraordinarily weak incumbent and a rather remarkably stronger challenger than she would have anticipated. But my point is this. I went to a Trump rally last night. I literally walked the line. It seemed like a mile long of Trump supporters standing in the cold for hours waiting to get in. I simply walked the line. Didn't know what I'd expect. But I'll tell you, I had 50 conversations with people, hospitable, friendly, kind. I would ask them, first rally, I'd say maybe half of the people I spoke to, first time they'd ever gone to a Trump rally. Diversity of politics, of races, of religions. It was astounding, everybody. And my message to Ms. Custer and every Democrat who is propagating this fallacy that Biden will win, it's a tragedy in waiting. Somebody had to stand up in the absence of others of courage, including governors from the Midwest, including my colleagues in the House and Senate. They sit on the sidelines instead of meeting the moment. The president never should have run again. We all know that. And I'm saying the quiet part out loud.
So you're saying the data is suggesting to you that he's not going to win again?
Well, the data, anybody who reads it would suggest, I can't imagine seeing it and saying that he has a good chance of winning. Not to mention, of course, the element of his stage in life. It's real. He's going to be 82 years old at the next election. I think he'll be 86 by the end of his next term. You know, there was a Time magazine cover when Bob Dole ran that questioned whether he was too old at 72. It's not an issue of age. It's an issue of Americans having determined that he is beyond the time at stage of life for him to run this country. And by the way, I think Donald Trump is in the same category.
Sure, they're not actually that far apart in age. Have you seen data, though, that suggests you would win? If this is all about data at the end of the day, what do you see?
My point, not at this stage because nobody knows me yet. Maybe the nice blessing of not being well known is 2/3 of the country doesn't hate me yet. And I mean this sincerely. I mean it very sincerely.
It's a pretty
My
desperate
job,
state of affairs.
That's American politics right now. I will introduce myself to the country. They will see how hard I work, where I show up, I run to the fire, I listen, I do what we do in America. I actually am campaigning. And I think in a matter of months, we will have data that does show that I will be able to defeat Donald Trump and Joe Biden won't. If that is different, if somehow Biden miraculously recovers and suddenly is ahead and I'm behind, I will absolutely end this and get behind him, but not until we have data that suggests one or the other. And right now, all I see is the deficiency of the coordinated candidate. And furthermore, if others would enter this race, I invite them. How about that? I'm inviting you to join this. The water is warm. This is practicing democracy. And if someone else can demonstrate that they're better positioned, we who wish to prevent another Trump White House should get behind them.
Let's talk about this contest in New Hampshire. What kind of a margin do you need to pull here to be taken seriously?
Well, I think after 10 weeks, zero name recognition and starting at zero in the polls, if we're in the 20s tomorrow, that would be extraordinary. But I think what people should really be paying attention to is where does Joe Biden end up tomorrow? You know, Bill Clinton achieved 84%, Barack Obama 81%.
This is a write-in campaign.
It's a write-in campaign with the incumbent president, who should be on the ballot, by the way. The unreported story of this whole primary is his rationale for not even appearing on the ballot, his own choice. But we all know there's a write-in campaign here. Every member of the cabinet, I think, has been up. The mayor of Boston, the governor of Massachusetts, a number of my own colleagues have been up here doing the same thing, telling people to write in Biden. There's a super PAC set up. My goodness, they are trying really hard, which I consider to be the hypocrisy of democracy. If I'm in the 20s, that would be spectacular. If he's anywhere close to 80, I would be shocked. In fact, anything I predict more in the 50s or 60s, which will be the first evidence that voters are actually being reflected by the polls saying that he cannot win.
There's been reporting on the eve of this primary about a robocall that has been going out to voters, an AI-generated voice of the president telling them to hold their vote until November. Do you know anything about that? What is your reaction to that?
Other than what I just read, and I just did read that, which, by the way, I hope you all know, the state of New Hampshire, the Attorney General here, just sent a letter to the Democratic National Committee, a cease and desist for the unlawful suppression of voters. So I don't know who's behind that. I think it's appalling. And I think here's the bigger issue. There was an outside group that also did a bot for Dean. I think it was called DeanBot, which is now taken down. But here's the real issue. The Biden administration has known that AI is coming down the pipeline. They understand the risks of deep fakes and have done almost nothing to secure us from it. No guardrails, no legislation, and no willingness to actually confront what is forthcoming. That, to me, is a metaphor for this entire problem.
There was an AI executive order.
But it has
pretty comprehensive.
It has not done anything to prevent the same thing right now, what you just referred to. Who did it? There's no way to identify right now. There might be an investigation. I'd sure love to know who did it. The notion of suppressing voters, by the way, I want voters to come out and vote. The Democratic National Committee is the only entity of which I'm aware who has been reprimanded for the suppression of voters in this election. And I would ask you to take a look at that letter.
Congressman Dean Phillips speaking with us here in Manchester, speaking to the hypocrisy of democracy, as he put it. And a conversation now with White House correspondent Jordan Fabian, who's also with us here in New Hampshire. When you see the final analysis piece drop after this race is called at some point tonight, it'll be Jordan writing it. And it's great to see you, sir. Thanks for coming back on Balance of Power. You cover the White House. Did Joe Biden ever call Dean Phillips after he got in the race?
Not to our knowledge, and the Biden campaign and the White House have not really even acknowledged this campaign is happening.
Yeah, it seems like it.
Yeah, I mean, look, they want to project this sense of inevitability around Biden's race, that he will be the nominee, and that they want to focus all of their attention on their likely opponent, Donald Trump. So they don't want to give Dean Phillips any oxygen here in New Hampshire.
We talked to Congresswoman Annie Kuster here the other day. She's helping to drive this write-in campaign. I mean, can you imagine it's a write-in campaign for a president of the United States? It's been a good generation since that has had to happen here. But could this be an embarrassment for Joe Biden? What if Dean Phillips pulls 50% or something?
It won't stop Biden's march to the nomination. As you mentioned earlier, the delegates here aren't going to count in the nominating contest.
Psychological knock.
Right, but symbolically it could. If Dean Phillips finishes within 5-10%, say, of Joe Biden, it's not going to look good for Joe Biden, and it could make Joe Biden look weak among the Democratic electorate here and raise questions about his strength among his own party, let alone the general electorate.
So somebody's going to do a victory speech tonight, either Donald Trump or Nikki Haley. Will we hear from the president after that, or the campaign, I suppose I should say?
There are no plans to, as part of this arrangement where the Democratic National Committee has picked South Carolina as the first nominating state. They cannot engage in this primary at all. In fact, if they do, I think there's some penalty where they would lose delegates. Wow. So they're not going to talk about this at all. This write-in campaign that you mentioned, it's being done unofficially by Biden supporters and a super PAC that's behind the effort.
But he can't have his fingerprints on it, is the point, and that's why we won't get a speech tonight.
Exactly.
This is remarkable. Here we are in New Hampshire for the first in the nation primary, even though it's not for Democrats. And the White House can't even act like it exists.
Yeah, this race has had just an odd feeling, Joe.
Isn't that
As someone who's covered it before, both of us, this used to be a hub of activity.
Where's the circus, Jordan?
Yeah, I mean, you look out in the lobby here at the DoubleTree, and it's a little sleepy. So
Jordan Fabian, this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. We have got stocks trading lower. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index, all in the red right now. S&P down 2 points. A little change, down less than 0.1%. Dow Industrials down 178, drop there of 0.5%. The NASDAQ 100 index down 3 points. Little change. NASDAQ Composite Index down 7, also little changed. 10-year yield 4.15%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.40%. Stocks trading in a narrow range ahead of a slew of company results that should offer insights on the state of the global economy. After the bell today, we will be hearing from Netflix, and ahead of the Netflix report, we've got Netflix trading right now down less than 0.1%. Wall Street is looking ahead to the January 31st FOMC decision and potentially what it signals for the rate cut outlook for the rest of the year. Also, specifically, what could happen in March. Michael Gapin is head of U.S. economics at BofA Securities, and he was interviewed this morning on surveillance.
What gets them to cut in March is the inflation data. That even if the activity side of the economy is doing well, as it is, it's really the deceleration in inflation and the fact that we're 6 or 7 months with annualized core PCE running at 2% or less. So as we roll into the March meeting, I think they get gradually more confident about the trajectory.
United Airlines Holdings profit poised to beat Wall Street's expectations this year as the carrier works to overcome costs from the grounding of certain Boeing 737 MAX planes. UAL shares, United shares, up 7.5%, part of a broader rally today in airline stocks. American up by 4% right now. Delta is advancing 3.9%. Southwest up 3.7%. JetBlue now up by 4.6%. Spot gold up $1 the ounce to 2023, up by about 0.1%. West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.5%, 74.42 a barrel. Again, recapping, stocks lower, little changed. S&P right now down 2 points, drop there of less than 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
This is Balance of Power with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
With Donald Trump now at 60% in the latest Suffolk University poll, one that we've been following on a daily basis since we got to New Hampshire. I'm Joe Matthew in Manchester. Welcome to a special edition of Bloomberg Balance of Power, coming to you from the Granite State. The voting is underway right now, and our panel is here. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors, at the table. Once again, it wouldn't be real if we didn't have Rick and Jeannie. Great to see you guys. It's actually happening now. And I want both of your take to start off here on this poll. We've been watching this spread increase for days on end now, Jeannie. People have been talking about a surprise. Maybe there's a momentum play here for Nikki Haley. But if that were the case, wouldn't these numbers look different?
They may. So primary polling is notoriously hard to do because, of course, the margin for error is increased enormously over other types of polling we would do. So that is one thing, and that's why we've seen historically the primary polls be off because, of course, people are switching between party normally. So, inter-party, so that makes a difference. But that said, there's so much polling in this race that I'm hard-pressed to imagine the polls are off that much. And we're not talking about a margin of error of 3, 4, 5%. We're talking, he's got leads of 14, 20, 25. Yes, right. So this would be a big, big miss on the part of the polls. That said, as Rick knows, it's happened in New Hampshire before. They like to surprise. But this is a really heavily polled race at this point.
Well, that's for sure. And this has been a daily poll. So these little gyrations are important, Rick. Trump 60, as I mentioned, Haley 38, where she's kind of been stuck for a few days now. How do you read it?
Yeah, as you say, these are daily tracks. So each night they roll a sample into the existing 3-day sample they've got. And it's really meant to look at the trajectory of the race, not the actual number. I think that, the conservatism of pollsters, like Jeannie was saying, is like, this isn't the number we think is the election's going to turn out. This is the direction that the election's going in. And what the direction tells us is Trump's picking up speed. it's been a lingering question since 2016. Can Donald Trump actually get more than 45% of his party's vote? Because it's always been split amongst his opponents, you know, the balance, and he wins a lot that way. This is the very first state that Donald Trump has a one-on-one with a legitimate contender for the nomination, and what we're seeing is he has no problem at all, at least in the polling, getting beyond 50%. And that is a threshold that nobody really has known for the last 8 years, and now we're seeing it in actuality. That being said, Nikki Haley has got 40%. I mean, she has got, you know, basically the balance of the Republican Party, a significant number of Republican primary voters and unaffiliateds are saying they don't want Donald Trump, and they want an option, and their option right now, and their only option right now, is Nikki Haley.
Wow. What are you going to be watching then tonight here, Jeannie? Because we're hearing talk of an early call. If we don't get one, does that mean that these numbers were misleading?
You know, I think the early call is going to benefit Donald Trump. So I think if it's called early, it will be, I don't want to say a repeat of the caucus, but something similar. You know, so that's what I'll be watching. I'll be watching turnout, because the larger this turnout, the better for Nikki Haley, I think. And of course, where people are turning out. It was a small sign, but we should mention she did sweep Dixville Notch. So that is a good thing. She got all 6 of the voters up there. But, you know, just to build on what Rick was saying, I think, you know, if Trump bests her here by huge numbers, the conventional wisdom that all of us were talking about, that he's not going to do as well in a head-to-head, that all goes by the wayside. You know, we kept saying Donald Trump's better off the more people in this race.
Yes,
well,
right.
Now it's a head-to-head, as Rick was saying. If he bests her here, that conventional wisdom, one of many pieces that's been blown up. Just like, you know, somebody who's got 91 indictments won't make a big run for the presidency either. So
wow.
several pieces of conventional wisdom.
Well, okay, so we're beyond the point of closing arguments. What do the candidates do other than watch at this point?
Today?
Yeah.
My favorite was John McCain. He liked to go to the movies. So we'd be sitting alone in a movie theater at 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
No stress.
That's with all of us reading our phones saying, what's happening? What's turnout? What's it look like? And him just sitting there watching a movie.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it was, but like they all have a different shtick, but literally there's nothing they really
There's
can't
no more
do.
door knocking or anything to affect this, is there?
They can hit the cables and the local news to try and, you know, spur people to turn out who haven't already turned out. But that takes about an hour to hit them all. and yeah, it's nerve-wracking for the candidates, right? They've invested so much into today. And then they get here, and there's really not much they can do to affect the outcome. Yeah. So, yeah, it's a campaign manager's best and worst day, because you have spent all day with your candidate trying to keep them calm while you're trying to figure out like what's happening in the polling places. But yeah, it's been kind of a quiet campaign, and today seems to be like that. I mean, you don't see actually Donald Trump doing any of the media. Yeah. He's sort of blanked here, doing nothing. I haven't seen much of Nikki Haley today. Her top surrogate and chief endorser, Governor Sununu, has been everywhere. You would think his name is on the ballot.
That's really something.
And to some degree it is, because his reputation as the most important endorsement that Nikki Haley has had in this campaign, any state, comes down to him today.
You know, Chris Sununu, sitting in that chair, Jeannie, said the Tim Scott endorsement meant nothing. He said it was meaningless. If she doesn't win, what does that say about his endorsement?
You know, I still think, by the way, I like to sit in Chris Sununu's chair. I still think that, it couldn't have hurt. I mean, Chris Sununu is so beloved in the state of New Hampshire. I think, you know, as he's been out so much, so many of us have said, gosh, maybe he really should have run. And I know that's not something he wanted to do at this point. So I wouldn't say it's meaningless. I would say that tells you what a juggernaut Donald Trump is in the Republican Party, and how much this is truly a party that he has changed, and changed in less than a decade. And we really all, if he does best her here, have to think about why people are so attracted to somebody. And I'll say it again, 91 felony indictments against him, and may be counted.
He's made a lot of money off those indictments.
He's made a lot of money, yeah.
Let's see where it goes from here. Jeannie Shanzano is with us, Rick Davis as well, as we try to break things down on our way to an election night here in the great state of New Hampshire. I'm Joe Matthew in Manchester with a lot more to follow. We heard from Dean Phillips earlier this hour. We'll get the panel's take on what in the world is happening on the Democratic side of the aisle and whether any of this is going to matter in New Hampshire. Stay with us on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.
This has been a test of the emergency alert system. You're listening to WBBR New York, Bloomberg 1130. This is Balance of Power with David Weston.
International tax competition between tax jurisdictions over the past 30, 40 years has been driving us to a more efficient tax.
This should be a bipartisan issue in terms of securing the capital.
Where the world of politics meets the world of business.
Clearly, time is going to be the enemy of the Congress. There's not enough time to get everything done.
I don't think the Fed is ready to spill the beans. I don't think they know yet what the beans are.
Balance of Power with David Weston on Bloomberg Radio.
Thanks for being with us on Balance of Power, live from Manchester, New Hampshire. Kaylee Lyons is with us at the table now. You just never know what's coming next, like this primary. You've had an interesting day so far already. You ready to do this tonight?
I think so. I wonder if we do know what's coming next. It seems everyone thinks they know what's coming next on the Republican side. Still an opportunity to be surprised. But there's also Democrats we need to pay attention to here, which we talk about a lot less.
Yeah, here. We heard earlier from Dean Phillips, and I'd love to hear from our panel on this because he's been spending a lot of time in New Hampshire for what appears to be no real reason. The delegates aren't going to count here in this race, and I wonder, Jeannie, if you understand the purpose of this exercise. Is in case Joe Biden somehow becomes incapacitated? Where does he think he's going?
Yeah, I mean, delegate-wise, he's not going very far. He won't, go out of New Hampshire. But I do think that if he is able to make a showing here, get a quarter, get a third of the vote, and gosh forbid something happens on Biden's campaign as we go down to the general and he doesn't make it, the fact that he decided not to play in New Hampshire is going to be something that we will all be talking about. So from that perspective, I do think Dean Phillips is raising, and you guys talked to him, a really important point about the lack of competition and also not playing in New Hampshire. And I still think Democrats should have played in New Hampshire. I don't see skipping it.
Yeah.
And so I think from that perspective, but delegate-wise, he's not going to go anywhere. There's no delegates at stake here.
Well, yeah, it's a very good point. When he was here, I also asked him, when he was taking part in a roundtable here at Bloomberg, what share of undeclared voters could you get? We talk about the undeclared impact on the Republican side, but could any actually be active on the Democratic side, do you think, Rick, or really just all of the action is in the GOP?
No, I think that you need to really understand undeclared voters, right? A lot of them are Democrats who just prefer to be undeclared. A lot of them are Republicans who will vote in today's election, who are, sort of independents in name only, right? They functionally act like Republicans. And then there's a group that actually believes that they are independents, even though there's no independent party to belong to. So he could get a share of those undeclared candidates who just historically always participate in a Democratic primary, and they have nothing else to do today, right? I mean, New Hampshireites are very keen on elections. They love it. They have a very high turnout rate proportionally to other states in America. They obsess over this stuff. They get all the candidates in their living rooms throughout the course of the year leading up to this. And Dean Phillips is running an energized campaign. He's a gregarious guy who is actually running the only campaign that, to me, kind of looks like a traditional New Hampshire campaign, where he's everywhere all the time, whether it's on TV or in a town hall. So, yeah, sure, he'll get a hunk of those, but it's mostly a protest vote against, the president and his lack of participation in New Hampshire, something that they hold dear here and they want to preserve. They do not want anybody else ever being the first in a nation primary.
South Carolina.
I'm not naming names.
Is he excommunicated when he goes back to Washington after all this? I'm assuming this is over.
Yeah, I didn't understand why he gave up his seat, to be honest, to do this. It sort of felt like a little of a Don Quixote kind of thing, but he has made a name for himself. He says he's going to be a Democrat. He's not going to be third party. So I don't think he wants to be excommunicated, but
he's not on the DNC.
He's not going to be very welcome for a while.
He told us yesterday, Jeannie, that if you look at past performance of incumbents here in New Hampshire historically, they get 80% plus of the vote here. What number would be embarrassing for President Biden? Suggests that maybe Dean Phillips is right about the weakness of his candidacy.
I think if Dean Phillips was ever able to get a quarter or a third of the vote, that would be a big signal. That said, let's not forget Joe Biden's number in New Hampshire in 2020 was pitifully low. Now, to your point, he wasn't an incumbent, but so they may be able to say, yeah, we did much better than we did 4 years ago. So, but I do think for a sitting president, if he is able to hold him like below 75, below 70, that is a signal that people on the ground are frustrated and they're Democrats or undecided.
Well, I can't think that we're going to spend too much time on this tonight, but you're asking an interesting question here about, I guess, the symbolic result that could happen. Does Joe Biden have to worry about that, Rick? If Dean Phillips pulls up 30 or 40%, people say, wait a minute, is this guy electable?
No, this is just an exercise in futility. I mean, first of all, the president isn't even on the ballot. And the only way he gets on a vote is if someone writes him in, which is like the hardest thing in the world to do. And they're not even investing in doing that. It's not like the DNC or anybody else is down here on the ground turning out Joe Biden write-in ballots. It's completely irrelevant to the ultimate nomination of Joe Biden. It's a media narrative that is just out there because Joe Biden looks like a relatively weak president. His numbers are awful. He's not out campaigning very aggressively. He's playing a Rose Garden strategy. This is a Rose Garden strategy, and this is sort of a fly in the ointment for the day. It goes away tomorrow.
Maybe he gets a show out of it.
Maybe.
You could land in a lot of interesting places after flaming
that
out in
idea
politics.
in management's head? Is
I
that what you're
don't know if
suggesting,
it's gonna
Joe?
be
Trying
here.
to talk us out of a job?
Listen, there are a lot of hours to fill in this clock, I'll tell you what. Until then, however, you're stuck with Joe and Kaylee. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano will come back next hour as our special coverage continues. Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from New Hampshire.
Voting is underway right now. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as New Hampshire finally gets its say in the Republican race for the nomination. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines. It's finally time to start counting some votes.
Yes, it is. 6 votes already have been counted
here
in New Hampshire, Joe. Dixville Notch.
That's
6 votes for Nikki Haley.
A sweep
Clean
for Nikki
sweep.
Haley, and that's supposed to be a leading indicator, correct? Maybe that's telling us something about a potential surprise tonight.
Well, we'll see how surprising it actually could be. Of course, there's been a lot of polling that suggests that Trump is pretty far ahead of Nikki Haley leading up to voters heading to the polls today. That latest Suffolk University Boston Globe poll, he's leading by 22 points with 60%
He reaches
support.
the 60% mark for the first time in this poll. They've been updating it on the daily, and it's something that we've been looking at very closely here. We'll talk about it more with our signature panel. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are with us here in Manchester, and so is Frank Luntz. Kaylee, we'll get inside the mind of Frank Luntz to get a sense of the polling and just the landscape here in New Hampshire, which feels so different to so many of us this time.
Well, and frankly, not just what happens here in New Hampshire, but what happens after New Hampshire. As Nikki Haley and some of her surrogates talk about, all I need is a strong second.
Yeah, sure.
Is that really true if you're also behind in South Carolina and in polling pretty much across the board?
Big question about momentum here and whether she can find it. We've got a lot ahead and some important voices to bring to you this hour after we update Wall Street. For that, of course, we go back to New York and get an update from Charlie Pellet. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Joe Matthews. Speaking of momentum, we got the S&P pushing higher, little change, but still up another 3 points. We are looking at records here, up by about 0.1%. NASDAQ Composite Index up by 23. That is a gain right now of just about 0.2%. Dow Jones Industrial Average lower by 144 points, a decline there of about 0.4%. NASDAQ 100 Index up 0.2%, higher now by 31 points. We've got the 10-year yielding 4.14% with a 2-year right now 4.40%. Gold up $2.50 the ounce, 2024 higher now by just about 0.1%. And a pullback for crude today, still with a 74 handle, 74.20 for WTI right now, down by about 0.8%. As for the overall market backdrop, Michael Zezas is global head of fixed income and public policy research at Morgan Stanley.
I mean, listen, I think the equity market is already kind of priced in a lot of ways for this idea of a soft landing, fixed income less so. And so to us, incrementally, unless AI is driving this really, really major uplift, then I think a lot of the incremental opportunity or sort of more reliable return opportunity is going to be in fixed income this year.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast, downloaded wherever you get your podcasts. Again, a retreat today for West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.8%. Halliburton, though, has joined rival SLB, Schlumberger, in boosting its quarterly dividend as the world's biggest oil field contractors gear up for an international boom amid slowing shale work. Right now, we've got Halliburton shares up 1.8%. Schlumberger, SLB, lower now by about 0.7%. Again, recapping, stocks are trading mixed. The S&P 500 index holding on to a 3-point gain. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, we thank you. Welcome to Bloomberg Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio and on YouTube. Kaylee, great to see you here in Manchester with hours left to actual polls closing here. It's a staggered poll.
Yes.
Is that like a laddered poll, as we would call it in Washington?
I
Most
guess so.
close at 7, the rest close at 8.
Yep.
We'll see if we get an early call.
Well, yeah, how close to 8 p.m. could we get that call? Keeping in mind that in Iowa, took about half an hour. The caucuses weren't even actually over, and it was called for Trump. He had a very commanding lead in Iowa. Essentially, the Associated Press and other networks made the estimation that there was no way any other candidate was going to be able to catch him. If it's closer in New Hampshire, though, are they going to be as willing to put a call out there that early, knowing that they got a good deal of blowback for it last week?
Especially with people still in line, potentially. It's a different animal, to your point, than caucusing. But we're really kind of obsessing over this new Suffolk number here and deeply curious to hear what Frank Luntz has to say about it. I've been looking forward to this conversation. We last spoke with Frank, of course, famed pollster, now at FIL, the firm that he runs here as a consultant. It's great to see you. And glad we got through both of these cold states together. It's almost over.
Well, you can hear it
Frank.
in my voice, unfortunately, and I apologize for those listening to me, but it's still better than watching me. In Iowa, we knew that Trump was right at the majority, and that was key. And we could not call whether or not Haley was going to come in second or third. Now with a two-person race, we know that I know that Trump has a majority. I have no doubt about that. The question is the gap 10% or more?
And by majority, you mean he'll secure at least 50%?
That's correct. And it's a ratio that I'm looking for. If it's less than 10%, she can make the case that she should stay in. If it's more than 10%, when she put a lot of time into here, she put a lot of effort, a lot of money into it. She had the governor following with her in every stop that they went, and he was very powerful. I don't know how you continue a campaign when the next state is South Carolina, her state, and she's losing it by big numbers.
Her campaign sent out a memo today, and I'm not sure if you've seen it, but essentially saying, everybody stay calm, we're staying in this race. They signed off on the letter with see y'all in South Carolina. Seems to be an indication we're going there regardless on February 24th. But her campaign manager pointed out in that memo, on Super Tuesday, 11 of the 16 states are open primaries. Is there a world in which she may not do well in South Carolina, but come Super Tuesday, enough Democrats could think Trump has the Republican nomination locked up if I don't do something, and I'll go out and vote for Nikki Haley?
Yes, there is, but here's the problem. That world exists here in New Hampshire. And if you can pull it off here in New Hampshire, why should you be able to pull it off in Super Tuesday? That's why the margin is so important. I'm not looking at winners or losers tonight. I believe I know what's going to happen, but the margin is everything.
This 60% number in the Suffolk poll is getting a lot of attention. It's the first time that Donald Trump has hit that level. Are those Ron DeSantis voters who are being added to the pile? How does he continue to gain? It's not like he's knocking on doors or doing anything different.
Well, he's not knocking on doors. He's simply running these rallies. They get a lot of attention. First, you lose Vivek, and all of his votes go to Trump. Actually, even before that, you lose Chris Christie. The expectation was that 2/3 of his vote, maybe 3/4, would end up with Nikki Haley. That does not seem to be the case. It looks like it's more than 50, about somewhere between 50-50 and 60-40. And with the Florida governor pulling out, those numbers are probably 2-1 or even 3-1 going to Trump. And here's the interesting factoid. All the candidates who were running 6 months ago have dropped out and supported Trump, not Haley. I think that's significant. I think that's had an impact on the polling. And as people make that final decision, they seem to be deciding that they're going to go with the candidate they know rather than the candidate that they don't know.
Well, one of those former candidates who backed Trump was South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, who was appointed to the Senate by Nikki Haley more than a decade ago. Kristen Sununu, the governor, and of course a Haley surrogate, told us that it was just disrespectful, but ultimately he thought it didn't matter. So is it that endorsements matter if you don't get them, not if you do? Is that essentially what you're saying?
That's a great question. They matter when there's so many of them. There are so many congressmen, so many senators that have endorsed Trump in the last 10 days. So many people from South Carolina even came up here. The current governor of South Carolina did a speech at the rally that I think we all attended a few days ago. That's significant because it sends a sign. And those undecided, it's less than 10%, but those undecideds are looking, where are the winds blowing? Where are the candidates making their decisions? And when they see that they're all from South Carolina, that does have an impact.
Spending time with Frank Luntz on Bloomberg TV and radio. Talk to us about the New Hampshire primary. What was such an important part of the process for so many years seems to have been downgraded into, I don't even know what we're calling this now, the lack of attendance that we're seeing, the lack of excitement, the lack of carnival atmosphere, and what appears to be a sense of inevitability in the state that's supposed to bring surprises.
So I remember this set. I remember other sets back 4 years ago. You couldn't get into the hotel.
Right.
You're 50 feet away from the lobby here. It's empty. There's no wait to get a table.
What's going on?
There's no one standing up. There's still candidates walking through. There's still governors, senators. But the intensity isn't there. First, because the Democrats don't really have a primary. I bought a hat that says, "Write in Joe Biden." Nobody wanted to buy it from me. Nobody cares. And on the
What, you were trying to arbitrage this thing? How much did you buy the hat for? What were you trying to sell it for?
I bought it for $9, tried to sell it for $19, and I failed.
Oh, there you go.
And by the way, then I don't think Bloomberg's ever going to invite me on because you want people who make money, not people who lose money. And so there's nothing on the Democratic side. And on the Republican side, the feeling is that the decision has been made. And I will tell you this, I've never been to a rally like Donald Trump's here. I had to stand out line for 45 minutes. It was snowing, it was cold as heck. And nobody left that line. They were willing to wait until the end. There were people still lined up that couldn't get into the building.
They got turned away, yeah.
That's significant. Now, Nikki Haley has big rallies, but nothing like that. And the intensity. Donald Trump spoke for over an hour and a half. Nobody left. Everybody laughed at jokes. Everybody participated. There is a passion to his supporters.
Yeah, and we've seen that in polling. They are far more enthusiastic to show up for him. More of their votes are for him rather than against Nikki Haley. That's not necessarily the case for Haley. A lot of those votes are cast for her because they're against Trump more than they are for her. So it gets to the turnout question on the point of how much enthusiasm Trump has with his supporters. We've heard over the last several days that it could be a record turnout for this vote, something to the tune of 320,000 plus, and that higher turnout would benefit Nikki Haley. Could it actually benefit Trump more if it's his voters that are driving that high turnout?
Absolutely. I'm not convinced that this is going to be a record turnout. In fact, I actually believe that it will not be.
Doesn't that sound unlikely based on what you just said?
Because those who've decided are participating and those who don't have a candidate in this race, because normally there's 4, 5, 6 candidates right now. Now there are only 2. So I think that depresses turnout. But the thing I want to raise with you, because viewers are always trying to look into the future, is that there are a lot of people who do not like Joe Biden, do not like Donald Trump, and if Trump wins by 10 points, tomorrow the conversation's going to be, is there going to be a third-party candidate? Does that third-party candidate have credibility? And will people be looking for an alternative to the two-party system? I think the answer to that is yes.
Boy. Then we're going to get into the no labels conversation.
Well, we had that conversation with Dean Phillips yesterday.
That's right. And he says he's not running. But we've heard a lot of interesting names who have gotten phone calls. There was even reporting that Nikki Haley is on their radar. If she doesn't put this together in New Hampshire, does she get a call from No Labels?
She'll probably get a call because she's been willing to run against the establishment. The key for No Labels is that they're even less establishment than Donald Trump. And it's not just about ideology. It's not just about being in the center. It's also how you carry yourself. The 3 attributes the American people are looking for right now. Number 1 is results. Number 2 is accountability. And number 3, a detailed plan of action. I'm not sure that describes either of the likely nominees. That could describe a third-party candidate. And notice that I didn't mention a single issue. It's all about their attributes, who they are as people.
I wonder how you look at the data we've seen on third parties or just on the idea that people would like an alternative to Trump and Biden. It's more than 2/3 say they don't want either of these men to be president of the United States again. The number is significantly lower, though, when people are asked if they would support a third-party candidate. So just dissatisfaction with these 2 candidates doesn't necessarily mean that they would be satisfied with someone else. What do you make of that?
So we know that that number is 70% that does not like either candidate. We know that 2/3 want to vote or will at least seriously consider another candidate. And we know that 46% now actually want to vote against Trump and Biden. That's a really large voter pool. Ross Perot got 19% in 1992. I believe a third-party candidate, a genuine third-party candidate, starts with 20% of the vote. All they need to do is add 2 or 3% more. They start to win electoral votes. Add 5% more or more, they become real players. And to get into the debates, you need 15% of the vote. I have no doubt that a true independent candidate that has those attributes we'll garner 15% of the vote.
Then you wonder if Donald Trump shows up for a three-way debate. That'll be an interesting one, assuming he
First
is,
one of the cycle.
Yeah, he is the nominee. We were fascinated to learn, Frank Luntz in Iowa, that immigration was the top issue for Republican voters above the economy. What is it here?
Same thing.
Here we are up closer to the Canadian border again, and immigration is the number one issue.
Immigration's a national issue. And with immigration, it's a fear of crime. It's a fear of violence. It's a fear of drugs, fentanyl. Immigration is a sign that we've lost control. So don't look at it as immigration where they're from. Look at what America's losing in the process, and that's the genesis of immigration. Do we have control of our borders? Do we have control of our citizenry? And what does this indicate for America going forward?
Well, we know that the immigration issue is one that a lot of voters aren't satisfied with the performance of President Biden, or even Congress for that matter, on the issue of the border. Just on the subject of the incumbent president, though, obviously we mentioned Dean Phillips, who is on the ballot here in New Hampshire. The incumbent president is not. And there is a writing campaign for him. There also was news yesterday of a deep fake, an AI-generated voice of Biden that was making robocalls to people, telling them to save their vote for November. Have we really started to properly think about the way that deepfakes, misinformation could impact this election?
And I apologize for coughing, but you just upset me. And so now you're getting the physical reaction. Yes, we've waited too long. Yes, this is a problem. It's going to become a crisis, and I'm going to get this out if it kills me. We have to study this. We have to figure this out, because people are going to start to change their votes and change their behavior if they can't even trust what they're being told. And that's what's happening right now. We already have given up on politics. We've given up on so much in the news media. And now that we have AI that's having a negative impact, this should scare every viewer, every listener, because once again, we are losing control. And that's my greatest fear, that we no longer think that we're in charge of our democracy. We no longer think that the public determines the outcome of the elections. We don't trust the results on election day. I've been frightened before, but this scares the hell out of me. And by the way, notice that my voice is cleared up, because I even think there's been divine intervention. Of all the things I could say on this show, there's nothing more important that if we lose the faith, trust, and a sense of control over our destiny in this country, we will lose everything. And that's what I'm most concerned about over the next 10 months.
Thanks for being with us. Again, we want to hear from you as we move on to South Carolina. But we appreciate your view, Frank Luntz, always here on Bloomberg. It's good to see you in New Hampshire.
It's an honor to be on this show.
Thank you, sir. I'm Joe Matthew, alongside Kaylee Lyons, as we drive forward with more voices from New Hampshire.
Yeah, absolutely. We still have a lot to discuss as the day is unfolding, Joe. I'm still looking for early indicators of turnout. Frank Luntz doesn't think we'll see the record turnout that some are predicting, but how many people show out today? And does that break in the former president's favor or Nikki Haley's?
We'll assemble the panel next. Rick and Jeannie are on the way in. I'm Joe Matthew, alongside Kaylee Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We are looking at a market right now that is trading in a narrow range higher right now on the S&P 500 index, up by 4 points. It is a down day for the Dow Jones Industrial Average, lower by 135 points. The Dow right now down by about 0.4%. S&P up 0.1%. NASDAQ, the composite index, up 27, up 0.2%, while the NASDAQ 100 index is up 31 right now, up by about 0.2%. 10-year 4.14%, 2-year 4.39%. Gold up $2.50 the ounce to 2024. That is a gain of 0.1%. A retreat for West Texas Intermediate crude today. WTI down 1%, $73.99 a barrel. Bitcoin today down another 1%, 39,413 on Bitcoin. Johnson & Johnson shares are tumbling after the company said profit margins in its medical device and technology unit fell last quarter, and drug sales will be lower in the second half of the year than the first. Right now, J&J trading lower by about 1.3%. Again, recapping narrow range for the U.S. stock market. Little change right now in the S&P 500 index. The S&P higher by 4 points, up by about 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pellett. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Listening to Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
Live from Manchester, New Hampshire, we've put the band back together. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are with us, Bloomberg Politics contributors, as we call them on our program, our signature panel, Kaylee, with a lot to figure out still. We're waiting for indications on turnout, obviously vote counting later. This is sort of the calm before the storm.
Yes. Are you feeling calm? Are we all feeling calm?
Got Rick and Jeannie here.
Yeah, I guess that's true. I always feel better when they're around. Also, we're on radio and TV now, so everyone can see the Charlie point.
You know, there's a lot to be said for that.
This is very important.
If you're watching us on Bloomberg Television, please know Charlie Pellett is not only the guy who points at you, he's the voice of the New York subway. He's an American icon. And when he does the patented double point, you know that something good is about to happen.
Yeah.
So, Rick Davis, here we are in New Hampshire. What are you waiting to learn now to get a better sense of what's going to happen tonight? We've had predictions of record turnout. We've had predictions of an 8:01 call. How about reality?
Yeah, reality is most people are sitting around making up stories about what turnout looks like. Oh, there's a lot of people in Precinct 7. And usually that's not to be believed, but that is a big issue here, right? The question is there enough enthusiasm in New Hampshire? A lot of people chatting about that. And does that enthusiasm, if there is lighter enthusiasm than normal, which seems to be the story, does that actually turn out in lower numbers? We had the Secretary of State here and talking to us about turnout, and he said 322,000 people will turn out. That's the target.
How about that?
I don't know. He's a really good counter, I guess. But if it's less than that, does that bode well for Donald Trump? Is his base so solid that he's going to have a turnout that's pretty predictable? And does that mean if it goes over that, does it enhance Nikki Haley's shot at winning this New Hampshire victory, or at least getting close to Donald Trump, close enough to get a ticket to South Carolina? Is that going to be closer to 340,000 people? And then what is the mix with the independents? Our campaign in 2000, John McCain, we got the record number of independents. 42% of the electorate were independents, unaligned voters who voted in that primary. Will it exceed a record number this time?
Well, that is the question, and it strikes me that, a week ago, we were all in Iowa dissecting the really low turnout there, 110,000, the lowest we had seen in over a decade, I believe, if not two. Weather was a factor there. Weather is way less a factor here, Jeannie. We all are not shivering right now. I've been able to feel my hands for 4 straight days. It's remarkable. But the enthusiasm thing that Rick was just pointing out is still a factor here, it seems. There's just a lot more enthusiasm among Trump voters than for voters who say they're voting for Nikki Haley, sure, but mostly it's a vote against the former president. So 340,000, if that's what people are saying she needs, is that really going to be able to be pulled off, even if it's sunny and above freezing outside.
It's definitely warmer than Des Moines. I have a hard time believing, we've all been talking, it feels different in New Hampshire today than it did 4 years ago, 8 years ago. Not that enthusiasm that you and Rick were just talking about. So I'm hard pressed to imagine the 322, let alone the AFP's number of 340. That would be huge and record breaking. So could it happen? Yes. AFP is very well organized on the ground. We can't forget that. They've spent a lot of money, but the enthusiasm is low. And let's face it, Nikki Haley, I think, now the votes haven't been counted, people are still voting, but she missed an important moment with that debate to get herself on the air in New Hampshire, get people out to vote, 90 minutes of free media on the air. She missed that. I understand why. But what is the change between Des Moines and New Hampshire, or Iowa and New Hampshire, that would pivot this thing? We've just seen the poll numbers for Trump going up. And so you're hard pressed to imagine that turnout I am at least, gets much higher. And I think that is the reality here. And, she has been struggling with enthusiasm throughout this campaign.
Rick, Bloomberg was the first to report Nikki Haley's $4 million ad buy in South Carolina, which I believe is set to begin tomorrow. When you hear news like that, is that a campaign trying to flex to make a point, knowing those ads could all be canceled, or does that tell you that they are determined to plow through her home state?
Yeah, it's a real commitment to go to the next state, right? When you put that much money on TV, you're flexing your organization and start to focus on that. Everybody from Iowa goes to South Carolina. I think the intention is to be ready for a positive outcome here, right? The only thing that would be a bad decision is to assume that you're not going to have a positive outcome out of here and then try to build a rally there. So I think they're banking on a good performance here, and that she can use whatever kind of momentum or narrative that comes out of New Hampshire to bolster her campaign there. But I would say she's been sort of unable to create that hard start, when she went from Iowa to here. She didn't hit the numbers that she wanted in Iowa. She didn't come in second, but she declared it's a two-person race. She was prescient. It wound up being a two-person race.
Yes.
But what drove that? DeSantis getting out and endorsing Trump. Good day for Trump. What else was a good day for Trump? Tim Scott flying from South Carolina, her home state, up here to endorse Donald Trump. Another good day for Trump. I don't remember the good day for Nikki Haley so far in New Hampshire.
Wow.
And each day is a win or a loss. Right now, I'd say the score out of the last 4 days was Trump 2, Haley 0.
And in that daily tracking poll from Suffolk and the Boston Globe, his lead over her has gotten wider and wider, now at 22 points, as Joe and I have been discussing. To return to the idea of what happens after this, though, regardless of whatever second place looks like for Nikki Haley, her campaign sent out a memo today basically saying, calm down, we're in this for the long haul, we're going to see you in South Carolina. And I brought this up with Frank Luntz, also pointing out that 11 of the 16 states on Super Tuesday have open primaries, potentially an opportunity for Democrats, more independent-minded voters to vote for Nikki Haley in those states. Frank Luntz's point was, that's also the case in New Hampshire. So if she can't do it there, or do it here, why could she do it there? What do you think about that?
Yeah, look, there is an argument, and you hear it in the sort of hallways around the Haley campaign, that you hang around long enough and people are going to realize that Donald Trump has lost it, right? That he's having cognitive issues at his rallies. Does that mean he pares back on his rallies and he doesn't start showing up? And as Jeannie likes to point out, he's got 91 indictments against him, and one of those might hit, and that's the lucky number for Nikki Haley, right? Wow. That's like the lottery. Yeah. So it's not a real campaign in that you're actually prosecuting a campaign against Donald Trump. It's a campaign where it relies upon Donald Trump to have a mistake, relies on Donald Trump to get convicted, relies on Donald Trump to fall off the stage. And that is a very defensive campaign, but one that we kind of have seen her wage right here in New Hampshire, where the attacks have been soft.
That's right.
And the big announcements have been nowhere.
So then, other than Chris Christie, maybe, that's the final analysis on every Republican campaign, right? Hey, I'm here in case something bad happens to the good guy, to the big guy, and he was the best president of my lifetime. I'll be here if something goes wrong, not I'm an alternative to Donald Trump.
Yeah, and this is what I get back to. With McCain's campaign, there was a positive message he was running on to get all these people out in New Hampshire and elsewhere. We don't see that with Nikki Haley. I've asked people, what is her message? They cannot tell you except, I may be electable in the general, which the numbers don't even hold with now, and Donald Trump, I'm an alternative. That, to your point, is not a winning message. And by the way, on the delegate count, the delegate math really suggests if she doesn't get the delegates here, she's not going to be able to move forward with any kind of delegate count that helps her. So yeah, they're going to have these, half a dozen or a dozen open primaries, but it's not going to help her with the delegate math. That is why, if she doesn't do it today, this thing is going to almost certainly be wrapped up, barring the 91 indictments and whatever happens in court.
You're holding out too.
Well, in my morning reading this morning, there was some in the newsletter from Politico, Rick, that actually, to Jeannie's point about the messaging from Nikki Haley, basically said a lot of the ads she's been running have said, we need a new leader, shouldn't be Trump or Biden, it should be me. Didn't get more specific than that. The ads Trump has been running, and those supporting him, one of the which stars Joe Matthew in some point, are very specific. Social Security, raising the retirement age, immigration and the border, her saying over and over again that illegal immigrants should not be treated as criminals. Is he doing a better job of this? Has his campaign done a better job of this the entire time?
Yeah, look, if you're handicapping this cycle and you're looking at each of those campaigns and how they've been managed, you have to give Donald Trump a clear win, right? He got out early and defined DeSantis in a very negative way for 6 months before DeSantis even announced he was running. And by the time he got in, he'd already lost. I mean, it was a de facto case. And when they pivoted to Nikki Haley, it's been relentless, as you say, sharp attacks on the issues, poll-driven, very specific to his constituency and keeping it together so she can impede upon it. And frankly, that offense hasn't needed a defense because nobody is attacking Donald Trump or his campaign. Their use of cash for lawyers, their lack of campaigning activity. I mean, like, there's a robust amount of tactical things you could be doing, but even on the issues, when you look at the Trump administration, it's not all roses, and yet they are not taking the opportunity to contrast on the issues.
This narrative has not improved for her since we have been on the ground in New Hampshire. It's really striking. Spending time with Rick and Jeannie here in a special edition of Balance of Power. We need to bring you up to date on what's happening world and national news right now with Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. As you've been talking about, voters in New Hampshire are casting their ballots in the state primary. Sarah Barley is defending her choice.
I voted for Nikki Haley today. I will do anything to not vote for Donald Trump.
Jennifer Gange lives in Tilton, New Hampshire.
I'm voting Trump no matter what. I don't know if I'm going to vote if he doesn't make it.
Both spoke with ABC News. Former President Trump has a substantial lead in the polls going into today's primary. Ukraine aid is held up in Congress, so Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is making a plea for other countries to step up. He addressed the Ukraine contact group of about 50 nations to dig deep and support Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's forces in their battle with Russia. He also took a swipe at Vladimir Putin.
Putin continues to sacrifice staggering numbers of Russian troops in his rash and reckless war of choice.
Today's video link address from Austin was his first public appearance since a 2-week hospitalization that provoked criticism from the White House and Congress over his failure to disclose details of the illness. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 1:20 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks are trading mixed right now. S&P little changed after beginning the week at a record. Shares of 3M, Johnson & Johnson weighing on the S&P 500 index. Right now the S&P little changed, higher by 1 point. We've got the Dow down 136, a decline now of 0.4%, while the NASDAQ Composite Index up 8 points, up by about 0.1%. NASDAQ 100 also higher now by just about 0.1%, up by 8 points as well. 10-year yield, 4.14% on the 10-year. We do have the 2-year now yielding 4.39%. Spot gold up $3.50 the ounce, now at $2,025. That is a gain there of 0.2%, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is down 0.9%, 74.07 for a barrel of WTI. Bitcoin down another 1.3%, 39,316 right now on Bitcoin. It is a busy week for technology earnings. Netflix today after the bell. Yes, we're going to be all over that number as it breaks. We've got Tesla tomorrow, Intel on Thursday, but what about the broader earnings backdrop? Eric Friedman is Chief Investment Officer at U.S. Bank. He was interviewed this morning on surveillance.
We're at 235 for S&P operating earnings for this year.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Again, recapping stocks higher, S&P up 1 point, little change there. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on both Bloomberg Television and radio. We are live in Manchester, New Hampshire, as today is the first in the nation primary. It's Donald Trump versus Nikki Haley. We're going to have much more on that race coming up as we focus on politics on this program, but we also focus on business. And on that note, a red headline just crossing the Bloomberg terminal: Apple now planning for its car for 2028 with less ambitious autonomy goals. So this date is slipping from the 2026 target previously now to 2028. Let's get more on this story now with Bloomberg technology co-host Ed Ludlow, who is joining us. So Ed, what else do we need to know here?
Yeah, it's basically a scaling back of what Apple planned to do. Sources are telling us that, as you say, 2028 is now the launch target for an Apple EV. It had been 2026, but they're also rethinking what that product looks like. Sources are saying that they want to do something which is more lower level of autonomy. Think level 2, something more akin to Tesla's current capabilities with autopilot. You know, Apple has been working on this secret car project for almost a decade. And it started out with the idea that this was going to be super high-end, almost fully autonomous with a high price point. But it's just seen high turnover of leadership and executives in the team working on it, little progress. And what we understand from sources and Bloomberg's Mark Gurman's reporting is that there were meetings over a big chunk of 2023 between the board, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, and Kevin Lynch, who leads the car project alongside the Apple Watch, where they basically said, we need some progress here. And the net result is this rethink of scaling back of both the timeline, but also of what the end product will look like.
All right, Ed, I'm just curious about the stock reaction while we have you here. Are investors relieved to hear this?
Yeah, a little knee-jerk. I see a little leg lower and then a rebound in the stock. I mean, the reason we pay attention to this, simply put, is Apple is a giant in the world of consumer electronics, right? Think about the volume of installed devices across iPhone, Mac, and wearables. We've long discussed their entry into the automotive market, but it hasn't gone very well. And because they are operating at the higher end of the market, there's a question about whether they'd ever be profitable making a product like this. But think about the benefit it would bring to the top line revenue if, as Mark Gurman says in his piece, they sold a $100,000 EV. Based on their track record in producing high volume goods and their global reach, and until very recently their position as the world's most valuable company, it's an interesting product and new category entry to watch. And so we do, and investors do as well.
All right, Ed, we appreciate The clutch analysis here. Ed Ludlow with breaking news here. If you want to read more about this story on Apple, obviously go to Bloomberg.com, find it on the terminal. Ed will be reporting throughout the day here on Bloomberg TV and radio as well. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons as we bring you special coverage from New Hampshire. It's primary day. Voting is underway. And there's been a lot of door knocking over the past couple of days, certainly for Nikki Haley. On behalf of the Americans for Prosperity, this group, AFP, has been knocking on tens of thousands of doors to try to make a difference in a race that appears to be leaning towards Donald Trump. And we're going to speak now with someone who's been right in the middle of it, Tracy Schmidt, speaking for AFP Action. Tracy, it's good to have you here. Do you have a final number on how many doors you knocked on behalf of Nikki Haley?
Well, it's and counting. We're still knocking on doors because we understand New Hampshire is an unusually engaged electorate who really is going to continue to listen and open to change their mind right until they walk in and place that ballot. So I think we're up over 100,000. I know we've made like almost 650,000 contacts in New Hampshire to kind of talk to folks about Nikki Haley and why she's the only candidate that can beat Joe Biden. So we've certainly been out there. We've got almost, I think, 200 people canvassing the state and really making that case to voters.
Well, how many of those door knocks then, Tracy, do you think are actually going to turn into votes in a polling booth? I know Americans for Prosperity has had suggested that there would be a higher turnout than we heard even from New Hampshire's Secretary of State. David Scanlon told Joe yesterday 322,000 is what he expects. Do you expect still that it will be higher based on what you're seeing early on?
Well, we're expecting, and the Secretary of State has been clear, they're expecting a record turnout. So I don't know how much higher you can get than a record turnout. But look, we got involved and we decided to endorse Nikki Haley and really engage in a presidential primary for the first time ever because we knew we could make a difference. We've seen from the data that we've collected, I think 6 million voters we've collected critical data about. And these are voters that we know are maybe have voted in a general, but maybe not a primary. We have several different strategies, but we understood that this is somewhere we can make a difference. And we heard from voters loud and clear, they weren't happy with the choice between Biden and Trump. So we go and have those conversations, hear from them. And I mean, we're seeing momentum. And what was interesting in terms of a lot of the folks we've talked to is they were responsive to Nikki Haley. They wanted to learn more about her policy. And 2/3 of even Trump voters, and this is kind of nationally, we found understood he had electability and baggage issues. So we saw a real opportunity there to make a difference and really change the trajectory in our country.
I want to know what happens when you knock on doors in an environment like this in a 2024 campaign, when there's such a lack of trust in institutions, there's so much division, vitriol when it comes to people's views on politics, and you're knocking on someone's door to give them the pitch on a candidate. What do you tend to receive when the door opens?
Well, look, obviously different people are more kind of open to this communication, but what's interesting about AFP is because we have a permanent grassroots organization, a lot of these folks in New Hampshire, they understand we've been on the ground, we've been fighting for policies, we've been engaged on the issues. So that, I think, also gives us a leg up, and then we have that built-in credibility with the voter. And we're reaching out to people that we believe we can make a difference and are going to be receptive to our issue and receptive to the idea of an alternative.
Do you fully expect, we only have about a minute left, but to take this effort to South Carolina, Tracy?
We're already in South Carolina. We've been in South Carolina and some of these other early states for months now.
But you'll stay there no matter the result today?
We're as long as there's a path, a clear path or a path for her nomination, we're absolutely going to be engaged. Nikki Haley's been clear. She's got an ad buy launching in South Carolina tomorrow. So New Hampshire is important, but what makes our organization unique is we have the ability to play the long game and the resources to stay in this thing. And we didn't expect this to end in January. That's been obviously something the national media's like to talk up. I feel like there was this eagerness to put a bow on this thing right out of Iowa, but that was never our expectation.
All right, Tracy, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it. Tracy Schmidt joining us as a spokesperson for AFP Action, of course, Koch-backed and now backing Nikki Haley. We got to talk about the Democrats here in Manchester as well, so we're going to do that next. This is Balance of Power live on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
listening to Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
Polls begin closing at 7 p.m. Manchester time and will be totally closed by 8. There are 22 delegates at stake. I feel like those playing along on their home game need to know this. We're talking about, Kaylee Lines, a race that some see as being over already. You need 1,215 delegates to be the Republican nominee. And we're just beginning. So we'd like to let this breathe for a minute and actually see what emerges tonight.
And that's the message from Nikki Haley. She says everybody's eager to write her obituary.
Yes, indeed.
It's been a long few weeks,
It's
Joe, as we've
easier
been
when
on
you
this
say
primary
obit.
trail
I
that may or may
understand.
not end today. But that's her message. Basically that this isn't over yet, even if everyone would like to declare it as such if she comes in second here in New Hampshire. But it's worth noting, it's not just the Republican delegates we have to consider. It's the fact that there's no Democratic delegates up for grabs in New Hampshire today.
And partly why we don't have kind of the fun that typically comes with the sort of carnival atmosphere. At the primary, the Democrats kind of wrote off New Hampshire, and by that we mean Joe Biden. When they put South Carolina to the front of the line, as a result, the DNC in New Hampshire, keeping its place here as the first in the nation, strips New Hampshire of its delegates. But it didn't keep Dean Phillips from coming here. Now, Joe Biden's not even on the ballot. There's a write-in campaign for Joe Biden. And as we discussed with Dean Phillips, he thinks he can embarrass the president into being taken seriously as a candidate.
That's what he suggested to us when we spoke with him yesterday. He pointed out that if you look historically at Democrat incumbents of the past, they can garner 80% plus of the vote here. Dean Phillips thinks he could get 20% plus, which would mean that Biden gets less than 80%. He suggested to us that he could surprise everyone here in New Hampshire, and that it could mean that Biden is a weaker candidate coming out of a state that he technically isn't even really competing in. But if not enough people write his name down on the ballot, that may be a very real conversation we are having come tomorrow morning.
Well, that's true. Look, New Hampshire is known for surprises.
Yes.
A lot of people came here packed up thinking they were going to get a big surprise on the Republican side. Wouldn't that be something if the surprise came for the Democrats, who aren't even actually supposed to be taking part, I should say, in this process? Then again, as we heard from Rick Davis, even if he blows the doors off as a candidate here, Dean Phillips will likely not be a conversation after this week.
Well, he says the data is going to inform him and his candidacy
but then he met
going
Kaylee
forward.
Lines.
Well, he suggested that if you look at the data, and this is all true, if you're looking at polling, Biden is dealing with a low approval rating. He is behind Trump in some, if not all, of the key swing states pretty much consistently across polling. And he says that data suggests that he is a weak and unelectable candidate. Does he have data that suggests he is a more electable candidate or that he could win in a general election? We posed that question to him, and he said, not yet.
Yeah, right.
It's not enough people know him. Also pointing out that maybe what works in his favor is that two-thirds of the country don't hate him yet.
That's the business of politics, apparently, and it's not one that I could imagine surviving. But we have a lot more to follow here, and we're going to be with you throughout the day and the evening on Bloomberg TV and radio. Special coverage starts at 8 p.m. Eastern time. We'll have our normal balance of power at 5, and we're going to follow this river of news straight through the New Hampshire primary until we have a winner tonight, as we prepare as well to kick things to New York. Carol Master and Tim Stenovic standing by for their conversation on Bloomberg Business Week. And I'll tell you what, Carol, you'll be done with this New Hampshire primary talk after today. Then it's on to South Carolina.
Gotta say, it's really been great listening to you guys and watching you guys. I love the conversation that you had with Mr. Lutz earlier about the deep fake, the Biden deep fake. So I know it's something we want to get into a little bit more on our show, but man, his tone changed dramatically.
Yeah, it definitely did. He had a bit of a coughing attack, which he said was because I upset him with that question. But that was what he was saying, is that this is actually very, very serious. This isn't just about New Hampshire or that someone created a robocall with Joe Biden's voice, that this is actually going to inform what voters are thinking, potentially affect how they vote and just the way democracy functions. And Frank Luntz thinks that this is not something we have begun to properly grapple with yet. And I would have to say, Dean Phillips, when we spoke with him yesterday and asked him about this, said he didn't know about the robocall, for the record, before the reporting came out, but that he also is very concerned about deepfakes and doesn't think President Biden has done enough to address it at this point.
Right. I mean, but what power does the president actually have over something like this? I mean, this technology is out there, and that's the scary thing. And I know, according to our reporting, it's going to be difficult to find out, Kaylee, who actually, was responsible for this robocall.
Yeah, I mean, the president has tried, Joe, to address artificial intelligence. He put out a pretty comprehensive executive order to tell each government agency what they need to do to address it. But to Tim's point, it might be toothpaste that's already out of the tube.
Right, exactly.
Hey,
and there's kind of a big eye roll that you get when this comes up in Washington, Tim, because we can't even figure out how to pass a budget. We're going to regulate AI.
I just
and
think
so
about-
I wonder if it's a conversation on this broadcast talking to government officials, or if it's a conversation on yours when we talk to executives from the tech world who are actually going to be the ones to get their arms
Who
around
did we talk to yesterday? Who said it's basically, was it Adobe?
Yeah, Adobe.
Actually regulating themselves when it comes to images that are getting out into the space, that they are only going to work with images that they've got the rights to, the licenses to. And so you've really got to kind of count on companies. I'm crossing everything, fingers, toes, everything. Companies to regulate themselves. But I don't know whether we're going to get that this time around.
Yeah, it seems like it's consistently how it goes in Washington. The process in D.C. is a lot slower than the process in Silicon Valley or elsewhere. You don't have as much bureaucracy and red tape, perhaps, to deal with. And of course, the candidates who are elected and their policies ultimately matter, which is what Joe and I will continue to cover here in New Hampshire.
Yep, that's right. We'll be listening for you guys coming up on Bloomberg Business Week, of course. And thanks to everybody for joining us here live from Manchester on Bloomberg Radio, TV, and YouTube, not to mention the satellite. Kaylee and I will meet you back here at 5 p.m. Eastern Time for Balance of Power. We'll set the table for our special coverage that, again, begins at 8 p.m. tonight. Carol and Tim will meet you a little bit later. It's all happening now in New Hampshire. With Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. Bloomberg Business Week starts right now.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer.
I love looking at different things that are going on in our economy. The Fed presidents kind of battle it out about what's going to happen next.
And Tim Stenivek.
Consumers are out there spending money. They have jobs. Higher for longer is what we hear from the Fed. Higher for longer is what we hear from the IMF also.
On Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody. Joining us on television, radio, on YouTube, on Bloomberg Originals. It is, Tuesday, January 23rd, 2024. And we've got an interesting day. The Fed blackout, it is definitely underway. That Fed meeting, of course, is next week. And Tim, what's really in charge is what's going on with earnings in a big way.
Yeah, they're certainly in the spotlight when it comes to trading. We're going to get into what earnings fundamentals are driving when it comes to equity moves and why, again, are rates pushing higher.
Yeah, and so ahead this hour, we've got a roundtable. And we want to talk about the earnings fundamentals and what is driving those equity moves. Where are the outperformers? A little hint, airlines is definitely among them. We're also going to be all in on politics this hour.
Yeah, we're going around the world, and we're also stopping here in the U.S. Of course, a huge day with the first-in-the-nation primary happening in New Hampshire. First up is several companies are already warning of an impact to costs because of the chaos in the Red Sea. We're going to look at what may be the economic and ultimate cost for Israel in what seems to be a fight to the bitter end.
Yeah, an interesting story about Ethan Bronner, who's out there in Israel. The race is on. We just talked with Joe and Kaylee, the New Hampshire primary, but the race is on to use AI to reach constituents. Is that you, President Biden, on the phone? I know they got into this. I am a little obsessed with this story.
It's not him.
No, it's not him.
It's a robocall. It's AI generated, and it has a lot of experts very concerned.
All right, we're going to get into that. We're also going to talk a little bit about maybe some no-frills flying, and we may get into that Apple Card, not doing it, is doing it, not doing it, not doing it again, right?
Yeah, Mark Gurman's got the latest on that. We're going to get an update, too. Also, get ready for more as maybe the only way forward when it comes to a greener future.
All right, lots to come. First up, though, a check on your top business stories. A look at the trade bouncing around here on the equity side. Let's get on over to Charlie Pellet.
Hi, thank you very much, Carol and Tim. Got to begin with that Bloomberg exclusive on Apple. Before we get to the numbers, mixed day on Wall Street, but Apple has reached a make-or-break point in its decade-old effort to build a car and is pivoting to a less ambitious design with the intent of finally bringing an EV to market. That news breaking in the past 20 minutes or so, and the latest now from our Ed Ludlow.
2028 is now the launch target for an Apple EV. It had been 2026, but they're also rethinking what that product looks like. Sources are saying that they want to do something which is more lower level of autonomy. Think level 2, something more akin to Tesla's current capabilities with autopilot.
And right now we've got Apple shares up by 0.5%. Mixed market, the Dow lower by 113 points, down by about 0.3%. S&P little changed, up 0.4%, up by about 0.1% after starting the week at a record. NASDAQ, the composite index, up 21, up by 0.1%. 10-year yield, 4.14%. We have got the 2-year, 4.39%. Gold up $3.50 the ounce to $20.25, up 0.2%. West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.7, 74.21 a barrel. Big news coming up after the close of trading. Yes, Netflix shares right now up 0.6%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It is time to get to the interview. It helps when I push the button to turn on the audio. Multitasking, that's what we do here at Bloomberg. Hey, listen, the interview today is really about the financial markets, what we are watching, what is swaying the moves, whether it's in the Treasury curve or whether it's on the equity side. We watch those day-to-day economic points and metrics, and right now we are really focused on earnings because that is definitely impacting the trade. So let's get to it because we have two individuals who are tracking both of those sides.
Bloomberg News markets reporter Abigail Doolittle is with us, along with Bloomberg News rates reporter Michael McKenzie. Both are here in our Bloomberg 1130 studio at Bloomberg headquarters in New York. Abigail, I want to start with you because earnings certainly front and center. Netflix after the bell. We got a couple companies reporting earlier today. So far, how are they impacting the trends when it comes to the equity trade?
Well, today we're seeing a little bit of fluctuation for the S&P 500, right around even. Right now, up slightly. Earlier had been down slightly. And I would say it's because of earnings. We have some to the upside and some to the downside. To the downside, 3M, down nearly 12%. It's worst day since 2019. And it's so interesting. They guided their profit outlook and their sales outlook for 2024. They cut it ever so slightly, but because they did this big restructuring last year, everybody was expecting this to be the turnaround quarter, and it's just not the case yet. So that stock down a lot. D.R. Horton down 9.5%.
That's a big hit.
Yeah, new home orders disappointing. And it's interesting because new home orders, that's both forward-looking and backward-looking. Forward-looking in terms of what are people planning on buying, but backward-looking because those orders were placed when mortgages were at 8%. So we're seeing that there was some weight on order activity due to that high mortgage rate. On the other side, though, United Airlines, I hate to use the pun, but flying high of 6.7%.
You can do it. This is a safe
It works,
zone,
it works. Well, you know, the main thing that happened to me, in my view, with United Airlines, so the midpoint of the profit guide for this year is higher than what had been expected, but very importantly, Delta Airlines, just a couple of weeks ago, their profit guide was disappointing. So United Airlines really did not repeat that, or maybe it was a lower bar for them because people were expecting that it could get kind of rough. And then we have Raytheon, or actually it's now called RTX, up nearly 6%, and they put up a solid quarter. Their cash view is above, their sales beat. So, you know, a real mixed bag. So net right now, the S&P 500 literally up less than 0.1%. Investors trying to decide what all of this means.
Right, but they're trading on those earnings fundamentals. You're
Yes, they
seeing it
are.
clearly.
Yes,
in
they are,
terms
which
of-
is a nice thing. It's not just the FOMO or the
right,
yeah.
or momentum or following
Yes.
that. Hey, speaking of interesting levels, we got to talk about Treasury yields. That 30-year approaching its 2024 high. Michael McKenzie, you write about this. You know, when I was looking at the equity trade and then I moved to the rate side, I'm like, what's going on with the rates market, the Treasury curve? Because it seems like it's just all a little bit higher today.
Yeah, it's creeping higher. This is a market that's kind of very much, it's already priced in a soft landing. And it's a market that's now waiting for inflation data at the end of this week. But it's also looking ahead to next week. We have a Fed meeting. We have the quarterly debt refunding, where the expectation is that they are going to increase the size of 10-year and 30-year bond sales because the deficit is running at a pretty high level. And then, of course, we get the employment report at the end of next Friday. So there's a lot to come, and it's a market that's currently now having to sort of navigate with a Fed blackout with communication, so you don't have that driver anymore. So
That's why earnings has become such a focus.
yeah, but it is interesting to see this market backing up as the equity market is doing well. We've had a series of record highs in stocks, and you're seeing a broadening of the equity market. So that suggests that the equity market thinks the soft landing is on track. So you should see some adjustment higher in yields. I mean, we're still sort of having to unwind a bit of that very, very strong rally we saw at the end of last year.
Across the curve, though?
Yes, it is happening across the curve. I mean, the curve has been trying to steepen, but it just can't get its mojo. It's still, 2s10s is still slightly inverted, and it's going to stay there because I think until the Fed actually does say we're cutting, the curve traditionally doesn't start to turn positive. So it's kind of, there's a sense there the market is on hold in bond land anyway.
And it does look like, right, Abigail, right now that investors are, all right, we're going to wait and see what the Fed ultimately gives us next week. Having said that, there was an interesting post on the Markets Live blog today about momentum favoring further tech sector gains. If you're an investor, momentum is your friend. And there's a chart out there, and I think we can bring it up for some of the folks who are watching on YouTube and on Bloomberg Originals. But basically, in the past decade, it shows that whenever a reasonable chunk of the index was showing as overbought, the index tended to keep rising in the next month. Not only that, but the more overbought it is, the better it does, which is interesting.
So that's really interesting. I'm actually going to...
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to pull up the chart because it's true that when an index becomes overbought from a technical standpoint, meaning the RSI, the relative strength index, goes above 70,
right,
that actually is bullish because it does indicate positive momentum. But the last time I looked at this chart, so I'm going to be very curious to look at it right now, it was actually showing a lower high. Yes, it's still a lower high. So I can put this in context for our listeners and viewers. So back at the end of last year, when the NASDAQ 100, the all-time high at that point, just below 17,000, the RSI was at 75 or so. It was 78. Now we have an all-time high, and it's at 72. So you have a higher high on less momentum. That's actually a bearish divergence. And I would also add, bringing it back to earnings, we have all these big tech names reporting starting next week. Netflix tonight, but really next week in terms of Apple, Google, and all these names. And the thing to really pay attention to here is the growth for both earnings and sales. None of these names, with the exception of Meta, a lot of them are single digit. A lot of them are below 20%. But then you take a look at the multiple. Apple, 29 times next year. Google, 20 times next year. Microsoft, 32 times. Amazon. So that's just a long way of saying that these names are overpriced. They have to deliver. If these companies don't deliver, if there's a wobble, Amazon every now and then pukes it out profit-wise because they want to spend it on something, or, Apple, I mean, their top-line growth for this next quarter we're looking at is expected to grow less than 1%. That's incredible for a stock that's trading at 30 times. So it's going to be really interesting to see amid the Fed.
Are you?
Both events at once.
Are you saying, and we're going to get to more on the Fed in just a second, but are you saying, Abigail, that some of these equities are expensive?
Very expensive.
We spoke with Nancy Tengler yesterday, who made the argument that
tech is the new defensive.
Yeah, that compared with where things were in the 90s, I mean, these stocks are cheap right now.
Based on looking at the Bloomberg, and I don't have it priced out relative to the 90s, but Apple, its trough PE is at like 10. Right now it's trading at a 29. So that to me is really pretty rich. Starting in the pandemic, that was when the whole thing around calling big tech safety, I've never been able to quite get my mind around that. But on the other hand, these names used to pay up for the growth. The growth is no longer there, but the multiple is still there. Something's got to give at some point, I think.
Yeah, and Michael, I wonder how, you watch the rates market specifically, but the earnings and the outlooks and what we hear from companies, it may be giving you an indication of when the Fed has to do something and how much they have to do and the timing of it all.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I've been talking to a couple of bond investors this week, and it's interesting how they're they're actually saying we're more risk on now, which means they're going more into corporate bonds. We've had a really big flows going into corporate credit this month already. So what you're seeing here is a growing admission from the bond crowd that, okay, the Fed stopped raising rates. That's why they were cautious. They bought into treasuries at 5%. They've had a good return from that. But now they're thinking, this is a soft landing, so we need to be in credit. We need to actually be a bit more risk on. Mm-hmm. So again, this is where equity earnings are so important, because you need to see those cash flows. That's the key thing for anyone who's investing in credit. So that means then that treasuries probably are going to be pushing higher in terms of yield for now, because the momentum is now really going to the soft landing, and it really comes down
There's
to
other opportunities, right?
Yeah, because you
and
can't.
Fixed income.
Yeah, and also this is what bond managers are going to. All those people sitting, that $6 trillion pot of money sitting in money markets, they're saying, you guys have got to come in. You've got to come and invest with us. So it's part of their sales pitch. But the key thing here is the Fed, and the key thing next week is they'll publish a statement. There's no updated economic projections. So it's going to really come down to, what does Powell say in the press conference? Is Powell happy with the way the markets are priced here at the moment? You've got stocks at record highs. You've got credit spreads getting tight. Financial conditions are really easing. So how does he kind of get around this? Because he was very dovish in December. So is he going to double down on the dovishness, or is he going to be more like Bostic and sort of stick to the middle ground here?
Right.
So I think it's really, and also bear in mind that we still, after